The knife glinted under the streetlight as it arced toward Officer Rachel Turner's exposed neck, but the warning hadn't come from her radio or her training. It came from the cracked lips of a homeless man everyone else ignored. "Don't talk," David Cole had whispered just moments before, his weathered hand gripping her arm with surprising strength. "Just listen. Your life depends on it." In that rain-soaked alley where society's forgotten and society's protectors collided, a partnership would form that would challenge everything Rachel thought she knew about courage, dignity, and the true meaning of salvation. So settle in, friends, and let me tell you about the night a badge didn't save a cop, a homeless man did. And hey, drop a comment about which city you're watching from. I'd love to see how far this story travels. Part 1. The rain had been falling for 3 hours straight, turning the streets of downtown Portland into rivers of black water that reflected the amber streetlights like pools of liquid gold. Officer Rachel Turner sat in her patrol car, watching the drops race down her windshield, while her police radio crackled with the usual Friday night chaos, domestic disputes, bar fights, the occasional traffic accident. She'd been on the force for 8 years, long enough to develop that sixth sense cops talk about, the one that tells you when something's about to go sideways. But tonight, that sense was quiet. Dead quiet. She reached for her coffee, now cold and bitter, and grimaced as she took a sip. The dashboard clock read 11:47 p.m. 13 more minutes until her shift ended, 13 more minutes until she could drive home to her empty apartment, feed her cat Murphy, and collapse into bed. The divorce papers on her kitchen counter could wait another day. Everything could wait another day. That's when she saw him. The man stood under the awning of a closed pawn shop, barely visible except for the orange glow of what might have been a cigarette. But as Rachel squinted through the rain-blurred glass, she realized it wasn't a cigarette at all. It was the reflection of the streetlight off something metal. A shopping cart, maybe. Or a knife. Her hand moved instinctively to her service weapon, fingers brushing the familiar polymer grip. 8 years of training kicked in muscle memory, taking over as she reached for her radio. "Unit 24 requesting." The man stepped forward into the light, and Rachel's words died in her throat. He wasn't holding a weapon. He was holding a leash, and at the end of it sat the saddest-looking German shepherd she'd ever seen. Both man and dog were soaked to the bone, their forms hunched against the relentless rain. The man's army surplus jacket hung off his frame like a deflated tent, and his beard, gray and tangled, dripped water onto boots, held together with duct tape. Rachel let out a breath she didn't know she'd been holding. Just another homeless veteran, probably. Portland had thousands of them, men and women who'd served their country only to end up forgotten on its streets. She'd make a welfare check, maybe call social services if he seemed particularly bad off, but that would be it. 13 minutes had just become 20, maybe 30. She stepped out of her patrol car, immediately regretting it, as the rain hammered down on her uniform. The vest underneath made her feel like she was wearing a portable sauna, and within seconds, water was running down her neck in cold streams. She pulled her cap lower and approached the man slowly, hands visible, body language non-threatening. You never knew how someone living on the streets might react to a uniform. "Evening, sir," she called out, having to raise her voice over the rain. "I'm Officer Turner. Just checking to make sure you're okay." The man didn't respond at first. His eyes, a startling blue even in the dim light, tracked her movement with an intensity that made her unconsciously check the position of her weapon again. The dog, however, wagged its tail weakly, a hopeful gesture that broke Rachel's heart a little. "Sir," she tried again, stepping closer. "Are you all right? Do you need—" "Don't talk." The words came out as barely more than a whisper, but something in the man's tone made Rachel freeze mid-step. It wasn't threatening exactly, It was urgent, desperate even. Just listen. He continued, his voice rough from disuse or illness or both. Please. Rachel's hand moved to her radio again, but the man shook his head sharply. No radio, not yet. His eyes darted past her, scanning the empty street. My name is David Cole, and in about 30 seconds, someone's going to try to kill you. The rational part of Rachel's brain, the part trained at the police academy, told her this was classic paranoid delusion. Homeless individuals often suffered from mental illness, and persecution fantasies were common. But that other part, that sixth sense that had saved her life more than once, suddenly roared to life. Mr. Cole, she said carefully, what makes you think of the blue sedan? David interrupted, nodding toward a car parked half a block away. It's been circling for the past hour. Parks for 10 minutes, drives around the block, parks again. Driver never gets out. Engine's still running even though it's been there for... He checked a watch that Rachel was surprised to see on his wrist. 8 minutes now. Rachel glanced at the sedan. Sure enough, exhaust fumes drifted from its tailpipe, visible in the cold air. She hadn't noticed it before, but now that David pointed it out, something did seem off. Who sat in a running car in the pouring rain at midnight without going anywhere? Could be an Uber driver waiting for a pickup, she said, though her voice lacked conviction. Could be, David agreed. Except Uber drivers don't usually remove their license plates. Rachel's blood chilled. She looked again, straining to see through the rain. The sedan's rear plate holder was indeed empty, just a dark rectangle where the plate should be. Stay here, she told David, her hand now firmly on her weapon. Officer Turner, David said, and Rachel started. She hadn't told him her last name. I know this sounds crazy, but you need to trust me. I've been watching that car because I've been watching you. Not in a creepy way, he added quickly, seeing her expression. I used to be a cop, 20 years Detroit PD. I know when someone's being hunted, and tonight you're the prey. Rachel studied his face, searching for signs of delusion or deceit. But David's eyes were clear-focused. Tired, yes. Haunted, definitely. But not crazy. If you were a cop, what happened? She asked, buying time while she figured out what to do. A shadow passed over David's features. That's a long story for another night. Right now, we need to... The sedan's door opened. Both Rachel and David turned to watch as a figure emerged, hood pulled up against the rain, hands hidden in the pockets of a dark raincoat. The person began walking toward them with deliberate, measured steps. Could be nothing, Rachel said, though her hand unsnaped the thumb brake on her holster. When's the last time someone got out of their car in this weather to take a midnight stroll? David asked. His dog, which had been lying down, suddenly stood, a low growl emanating from its throat. The figure was 50 feet away now. 40, 30. Sir, I need you to stop right there, Rachel called out, using her command voice. Portland Police! The figure kept walking. Sir, stop where you are and show me your hands. 20 feet. The person's head tilted up slightly, and Rachel caught a glimpse of a face, young, male, Caucasian, with eyes that seemed to look right through her. Gun or knife? David asked quietly. What? Is he carrying a gun or a knife? The way he's walking, favoring his right side, he's concealing something. Gun would be in the waistband, knife in the pocket. Which is it? Rachel didn't have time to answer. The man suddenly burst into a sprint, his right hand emerging from his pocket. The streetlight caught the blade, 8 inches of serrated steel aimed directly at Rachel's center mass. Training took over. Rachel's weapon cleared leather as she backpedaled, trying to create distance. But the wet pavement betrayed her. Her boot slipped on a patch of oil and she felt herself falling backward. Time seemed to slow. as she watched the knife descending toward her. The attacker's face contorted with an expression of pure hatred she didn't understand. Then David moved. For a man who'd looked half dead minutes before, he showed surprising agility. He lunged forward, catching the attacker's wrist with both hands, redirecting the blade away from Rachel. The two men crashed into the brick wall of the pawn shop, David using his body weight to pin the attacker's arm. "The knife!" David shouted. "Get the knife!" Rachel scrambled to her feet. Weapon trained on the struggling men, but they were too close together, writhing in a deadly dance. She couldn't get a clear shot without risking hitting David. The dog joined the fray, latching onto the attacker's leg with a snarl that sounded more wolf than German shepherd. The attacker screamed, trying to shake the animal off while still fighting for control of the knife. Rachel holstered her weapon and dove in, grabbing the attacker's wrist alongside David. Together they slammed his hand against the wall once, twice, 3 times until the knife clattered to the ground. Rachel kicked it away, then pulled the attacker backward, using a technique she'd practiced 1,000 times to bring him to the ground. "Stop resisting," she commanded, driving her knee into his back while reaching for her cuffs. "You're under arrest." The man continued to struggle, screaming obscenities that made no sense. Something about justice, about revenge, about making her pay. Rachel managed to get one cuff on, then the other, before finally allowing herself to breathe. "You okay?" she asked David, who had slumped against the wall, chest heaving. "Been better," he wheezed, then managed a weak smile. "Been worse too." Rachel called for backup and an ambulance, her voice steady despite the adrenaline still coursing through her veins. Within minutes, the quiet street transformed into a circus of flashing lights and sirens. The attacker, who turned out to be named Marcus Webb, was loaded into a patrol car, still ranting about something Rachel couldn't quite make out. As the EMTs checked David for injuries, Rachel noticed he didn't want anyone from dispatch running his name. The rain had finally stopped, leaving the air smelling clean and metallic. She sat next to David on the ambulance bumper, watching him pet his dog with gentle, practiced strokes. "You saved my life," she said simply. David shrugged. "You would have handled it." "No." Rachel shook her head. "I was going down. That knife would have found its mark if you hadn't intervened. So thank you." They sat in silence for a moment before Rachel asked the question that had been nagging at her. "How did you know my name, my last name, I mean? And how did you know he was coming for me specifically?" David was quiet for so long that Rachel thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was heavy with the exhaustion that went beyond physical tiredness. "I've been living on these streets for 3 years, he began. "You learn to become invisible, to see without being seen. About a week ago, I noticed someone had been asking questions about you. Homeless folks mostly, offering money for information about your routine, your patrol routes. Nobody thought much of it. People ask weird questions all the time, but it set off alarm bells for me. Why didn't you report it?" David gave her a look that said everything. Who would believe a homeless man claiming someone was stalking a police officer? "I started paying attention," he continued. "Figured out your pattern. You always park in the same spot on Friday nights, always get out to check on the homeless folks in this area. You're one of the few who actually does welfare checks instead of just running us off. So I've been waiting here each Friday watching. Tonight when I saw that sedan..." He trailed off, shrugging. Rachel studied his face in the ambulance's harsh light. Beneath the dirt and exhaustion, she could see the cop he used to be. The vigilance, the protective instinct, it was still there, buried but not dead. "Detroit PD, you said?" David nodded. "Detective, Homicide Division. What happened?" This time the silence stretched even longer. The dog, sensing its master's distress, nuzzled against his leg. "I had a partner," David finally said. "Pete Morrison. Best cop I ever knew. We were working a case, a serial killer targeting homeless women. We got close, too close, maybe. The killer figured out who we were, came after our families." His voice broke slightly. "Pete's wife and daughter were murdered while we were on shift. Pete couldn't handle it. Ate his gun a week later." Rachel felt her throat tighten. "Every cop's worst nightmare, the job following you home, touching the people you loved." "The killer?" she asked. "We got him. I got him," David corrected. "But afterward, I couldn't. I started drinking. Heavy. Lost my wife, my kids won't talk to me, lost my job, my pension, everything. Ended up here." He gestured vaguely at the street. "Some days I think Pete had the right idea." "Don't say that." "I'm not going to do anything," David assured her. "Got Max here depending on me." He scratched the dog behind its ears. "Found him as a puppy, abandoned in a dumpster. We look after each other now." A detective approached them. Rodriguez. Rachel knew him from previous cases. "Turner, you want to tell me what happened here?" Rachel gave her statement, making sure to emphasize David's role in preventing the attack. Rodriguez took notes, occasionally glancing at David with barely concealed skepticism. "So this homeless guy just happened to notice suspicious activity and saved you." Rodriguez summarized his tone, suggesting what he thought of that story. "This homeless guy is a former detective with 20 years on the job," Rachel shot back. "And yes, he saved my life. Make sure that goes in the report." Rodriguez shrugged and walked away to interview other witnesses, not that there were any. The street had been empty except for Rachel, David, and their attacker. "You didn't have to do that," David said once they were alone again. "Do what? Defend me. Most cops wouldn't." Rachel was quiet for a moment, thinking about all the times she'd responded to calls about homeless individuals, the business owners who wanted them moved along, the residents who complained about them existing in public spaces. How many times had she been that cop, the one who saw the homeless as problems to be managed, rather than people to be helped? "Can I ask you something?" she said. "That thing you said about watching my patrol patterns, you've really been waiting here every Friday night?" David nodded. "Like I said, you're one of the good ones. You talk to us like we're human. Do you know how rare that is?" Rachel felt shame wash over her. Being treated like a human being shouldn't be rare. It should be the bare minimum. "What will you do now?" she asked. "Same thing I do every night. Find somewhere dry to sleep, try to keep warm, wake up, and do it again tomorrow." "The city has shelters." "The shelters are more dangerous than the streets," David interrupted. "At least out here Max can protect me. They don't allow dogs in the shelters, and I'm not leaving him." Rachel understood. In David's position, she wouldn't abandon the one friend she had left either. An idea formed in her mind, one that went against protocol, probably against regulations, definitely against common sense. But this man had just saved her life. And more than that, he'd been watching out for her for who knows how long, a guardian angel in a torn army jacket. "Listen," she said. "I've got a garage, detached behind my house. It's not much, but it's dry and warm. There's a cot in there from when my ex used to pretend to work on cars. You and Max could stay there tonight, at least until we figure out something better." David looked at her like she'd suggested he move to Mars. "I couldn't." "You saved my life," Rachel said firmly. "The least I can do is offer you a dry place to sleep. Your department wouldn't approve. My department doesn't have to know. And frankly, after tonight, I don't much care what they approve of." David was quiet, considering. Rachel could see the war playing out on his face, pride versus practicality, independence versus exhaustion. "Just for tonight," he finally said. Just for tonight. Rachel agreed, though they both knew it was a lie. Marcus Webb, it turned out, was the ex-boyfriend of a woman Rachel had arrested 6 months prior for assault. The woman, Christina Valdez, had attacked her neighbor Hut with a baseball bat over a parking dispute. It had been a routine arrest, one of dozens Rachel made each month. She hadn't thought about it since. But Christina had thought about it. She'd thought about it every day in jail, apparently nurturing a grudge that had metastasized into full-blown obsession. She'd convinced Marcus that Rachel had planted evidence, had violated her civil rights, had ruined her life out of some personal vendetta. Marcus, blinded by love or stupidity, or both, had decided to exact revenge. He's looking at attempted murder of a police officer, Detective Rodriguez told Rachel the next morning. That's 25 to life minimum. Christina's looking at conspiracy charges. They're both done. Rachel sat in the station's break room nursing her third cup of coffee and trying to process it all. In 8 years on this force, she'd been in dangerous situations, before foot pursuits, domestic violence calls gone bad, one memorable incident involving a man with a machete and a serious meth problem. But she'd never been specifically targeted before, never been hunted. You okay? Rodriguez asked, his earlier skepticism replaced by genuine concern. Yeah, Rachel lied. Just thinking. About the homeless guy. His name is David. And yeah, about him. Rodriguez sat down across from her, his expression thoughtful. You know, I ran his name after you left last night. David Cole, Detroit PD. Guy was a legend. Solved 13 cold cases, had one of the highest clearance rates in the department. There were rumors about what happened with his partner, but nobody talks about it. It's like the whole thing just got buried. One day he's Detroit's golden boy, the next he's gone. No press conference, no official statement, nothing. Rachel frowned. Police departments usually made a big deal when they lost an officer, especially one killed in the line of duty. For Pete Morrison's death to be swept under the rug suggested something more complicated than David's version of events. You think he was lying? Rodriguez shook his head. No, I think he was telling the truth. I just don't think it was the whole truth. Before Rachel could respond, her phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. Thank you for the garage. Max says thank you too. We'll be gone by tonight. D. She'd given David her number before dropping him off at her house the previous night, watching him walk into her garage like he was entering a foreign country. The look on his face when he'd seen the cot clean with actual sheets and a pillow had nearly broken her heart. I've got to go, she told Rodriguez. Your shift doesn't start for 6 hours. I know. Personal errand. Rodriguez gave her a knowing look, but didn't press. Be careful, Turner. Getting involved with strays never ends well. He's not a stray, Rachel said, surprised by the anger in her voice. He's a human being. She left before Rodriguez could respond, driving through Portland's Saturday morning traffic toward her house in the Jade District. The rain had returned lighter than last night, but steady, turning the city into an impressionist painting of grays and greens. When she pulled into her driveway, she could see light coming from the garage windows. She knocked before entering. It seemed only polite, even if it was her property. It's open, David's voice called. She found him sitting on the floor, Max's head in his lap, both of them looking cleaner than they had the night before. The garage's utility sink showed signs of recent use, and David's hair was still damp. Hope you don't mind, he said, gesturing at the sink. Been a while since I had access to hot water. Of course I don't mind. Rachel held up the bag she'd brought. Thought you might be hungry. Bagels from that place on Alberta, and I grabbed some dog food for Max. David's eyes widened as she unpacked the food. 2 everything bagels with cream cheese, a large coffee, a bottle of orange juice, and a 20-pound bag of high-quality dog food that had cost more than Rachel usually spent on her own groceries. "This is too much," he said. "This is breakfast," Rachel corrected, handing him a bagel. "Eat." They ate in companionable silence, Max wolfing down his bowl of kibble with enthusiasm that suggested it had been a while since his last proper meal. Rachel noticed David only ate half his bagel, wrapping the rest carefully in the paper bag. "For later," he explained, seeing her look. "David, can I ask you something? What really happened in Detroit?" He was quiet for a long moment, staring at his coffee like it might hold answers. "What did you find out?" he asked instead of answering. "That your partner's death was hushed up, that you left under mysterious circumstances, that nothing about the official story makes sense." David nodded slowly. "Pete didn't kill himself. He was murdered." Rachel felt her blood chill. "By who?" "By the people who were supposed to protect him. The killer we were chased, Thomas Brennan, he had connections. Cops, judges, city officials. We didn't know how deep it went until it was too late. Pete found evidence of a protection racket, cops taking money to look the other way while Brennan hunted homeless women. He was going to expose it all. And they killed him for it. Made it look like a suicide. His wife and daughter. That was real. Brennan killed them to send a message. But Pete's death, that was the department cleaning house. And you?" "I was given a choice. Leave quietly and live or stay and probably end up like Pete. I took the coward's way out. I ran." Rachel absorbed this, her mind racing. If David was telling the truth and her instincts said he was, then he'd been living with this knowledge for 3 years, unable to do anything about it. "Why didn't you go to the FBI Internal Affairs?" "With what proof? They destroyed everything. And who's going to believe a drunk ex-cop?" "By the time I sobered up enough to try, I was already on the streets. No credibility, no resources, no hope. You could have... What walked into a federal building looking like this?" David gestured at himself. "They wouldn't have let me pass security." He was right, and Rachel knew it. The system wasn't designed to listen to people like David, no matter what they might have been before. "We could try now," she suggested. "I could help you. We could..." "No." David's voice was firm. "I'm done with that life. I couldn't save Pete, couldn't avenge him, couldn't even save myself. The best I can do now is what I did last night, try to help when I can, where I can." "That's not enough. You deserve..." "I deserve exactly what I have," David interrupted. "I failed my partner. I failed my family. This is my penance." Rachel wanted to argue, but she could see the walls going up behind his eyes, the same walls every cop learned to build to keep the job from destroying them. David had just built his higher and thicker than most. "Okay," she said. "But the offer stands. The garage, I mean. You and Max can stay as long as you need." "I told you we'll be gone by tonight." "Where will you go?" David shrugged. "There's a spot under the Morrison Bridge that's usually dry. Max likes it there, he can chase the rats." The thought of this man, this former detective who'd saved her life sleeping under a bridge while she had an empty garage, made Rachel's stomach turn. "Please stay," she said, "at least until the weather improves." "The weather in Portland never improves," David said with a slight smile. "Then stay until you find something better." "Rachel, Officer Turner, you can't..." "My name is Rachel, just Rachel, and I can do whatever I want with my own garage." They stared at each other for a moment, and Rachel saw something shift in David's expression. Hope, maybe, or just exhaustion winning out over pride. "A few days," he said finally. Just until I figure out our next move. A few days, Rachel agreed. But a few days turned into a week, and a week turned into 2, and before Rachel knew it, David and Max had become fixtures in her life. She'd bring breakfast before her morning shifts, dinner after her evening ones. They'd talk about the job, about the streets, about everything and nothing. David would share intelligence he'd gathered from his homeless network, tips about drug deals or violent offenders that Rachel would pass along to the appropriate departments, always protecting her source. It was 3 weeks after the attack that everything changed again. Rachel was working a day shift, responding to a call about a disturbance at a convenience store, when she heard a familiar bark. She looked up to see Max running toward her, no leash, no David, panic in every line of the dog's body. "Max!" she called, and the dog skidded to a stop in front of her, barking urgently and then turning back the way he'd come. Rachel's blood went cold. She'd seen enough movies to know what this meant, but more importantly, she'd been a cop long enough to know that animals didn't act like this unless something was seriously wrong. "Show me," she told Max, who immediately took off running. Rachel followed, calling in her position to dispatch and requesting backup to follow her GPS. Max led her 6 blocks through an alley around a demolished building, and finally to an abandoned warehouse that had been scheduled for demolition for years, but somehow never was. She could hear crying before she saw anything high-pitched, terrified young. A child. Rachel drew her weapon, approaching carefully. Max had stopped at a broken door, whining and pawing at the ground. Through the gap, Rachel could hear voices, David's low rumble and another man's angry shouts. She peered inside and her heart nearly stopped. David was standing between a man with a gun and a small girl, maybe 6 or 7 years old, huddled in the corner. The girl's face was streaked with tears and dirt, her pink jacket torn. An Amber Alert victim, Emma Rodriguez, kidnapped from her school playground 2 days ago. "Just walk away, old man," the gunman was saying. "This isn't your problem." "I'm making it my problem," David replied, his voice steady. "You want to hurt that girl, you go through me first." "Are you insane? You're a homeless nobody. No one will even miss you." "Maybe not. But that girl has a family, parents who love her, a future ahead of her. You're not taking that away." Rachel could see David's hands shaking, not from fear, she realized, but from withdrawal. He'd mentioned trying to get clean, cutting back on the alcohol that had been his companion for 3 years. He was detoxing, probably feeling like death, and still standing between a gunman and a child. She pulled out her phone, texting her exact location to dispatch with a request for silent approach. Then she began moving, using skills she'd learned in tactical training to approach without being seen. "I'll give you one last chance," the gunman said, raising his weapon to point at David's chest. "Then you better make it count," David replied. "Because if you miss, I'm going to show you what 20 years of homicide work taught me about hurting people who hurt kids." It was a bluff. David was in no shape to fight anyone, but his tone was so cold, so certain, that the gunman actually took a step back. That's when Rachel struck. "Police, drop the weapon." The gunman spun toward her voice, and several things happened at once. David lunged forward, pushing Emma further into the corner and shielding her with his body. Max burst through the door, all teeth and fury, heading straight for the gunman. And Rachel, seeing the gun swinging toward David and the girl, did the only thing she could. She fired. The gunman went down, his weapon clattering across the concrete floor. Rachel kicked it away, then checked his pulse. Alive but unconscious. The shot had caught him in the shoulder, a textbook takedown. "Emma," she called. "Emma Rodriguez, I'm Police Officer Turner. You're safe now." The little girl peered out from behind David, her eyes huge with terror and hope. "Is it over?" she whispered. "It's over, sweetheart." David assured her, his voice gentle now. You're going home. The next hour was a blur of activity. Paramedics, detectives, crime scene technicians, reporters. Emma was reunited with her parents, who sobbed with relief and joy. The kidnapper, a registered sex offender named Carl Hoffman, who'd violated his parole, was taken into custody with charges that would ensure he never saw freedom again. And through it all, David tried to fade into the background, to disappear like he always did. But Rachel wouldn't let him. "He's the hero here," she told anyone who would listen. David Cole found her protected, risked his life for her. The media loved it. Homeless hero saves kidnapped girl. Former detective's street instincts save child. Guardian angel in army surplus. David hated every second of it. "I didn't do it for attention," he told Rachel that night sitting in her garage while Max dozed at his feet. "I did it because it was right." "I know," Rachel said. "But maybe the attention isn't such a bad thing." "What do you mean?" She pulled out her phone, showing him an email she'd received an hour earlier. "Detroit PD. They want to talk to you." David's face went pale. "No. David, this could be your chance. To clear your name, to get justice for Pete." "There is no justice for Pete," David exploded. Then immediately looked ashamed. "I'm sorry. I can't go back there. I can't face it all again." Rachel wanted to push, but she could see the pain in his eyes, the weight of 3 years of guilt and grief crushing down on him. "Okay," she said, "but there's something else." She showed him another email, this one from the Portland Police Bureau. "They want to offer you a job," she said. "Civilian consultant working with the homeless outreach unit. It comes with a salary, benefits, even housing assistance." David stared at the phone like it might bite him. "I can't," he said finally. "Why not?" "Because I'm not ready. Because I'm still a drunk. Because I don't deserve—" "Stop." Rachel's voice was sharp. "You want to talk about what you deserve. You deserve a second chance. You deserve to use your skills to help people. You deserve to not sleep under a bridge while you're saving children and police officers." "Rachel." "No, listen to me. I've known you for 3 weeks, and in that time you've saved my life and Emma's. How many other people could you help if you had resources? How many other kids, other cops, other homeless individuals who just need someone to give a damn?" David was quiet for a long moment, absently petting Max's head. "What if I fail?" he asked finally. "Then you fail. But at least you'll have tried." The next morning, Rachel drove David to the police station. He'd showered, shaved, and was wearing clothes Rachel had bought him. Nothing fancy, just khaki kamis and a button-down shirt, but he looked like a different person. Or rather, he looked like the person he used to be. The meeting was with Captain Jessica Morgan, a tough but fair woman who'd risen through the ranks by actually caring about the communities she served. She listened to David's story, asked pointed questions, and made notes. "Your record in Detroit is impressive," she said finally. 13 cold cases solved. Commendations for bravery. Until I became a liability," David finished. "Until you suffered a personal tragedy that would have broken anyone," Captain Morgan corrected. "The question is, are you ready to come back?" "I don't know," David said honestly, "but I want to try." "That's all I need to hear. The position we're offering is unique. You'd be a liaison between the department and the homeless community, building trust, gathering intelligence, helping us serve that population better, while also addressing the criminal elements that prey on them." "What about Max?" David asked. Captain Morgan smiled. "Officer Turner mentioned you had a partner. We can make accommodations. Consider him Portland's first K-9 outreach specialist." For the first time in 3 years, Rachel saw David genuinely smile. The transition wasn't easy. David struggled with the structure, with being indoors, with having responsibilities again. There were bad days when the urge to drink was overwhelming, when the ghosts of Detroit came calling. But there were good days too, days when he helped locate missing persons, when he prevented crimes before they happened, when he convinced homeless veterans to accept services they desperately needed. Rachel remained his anchor through it all. What had started as gratitude for saving her life evolved into friendship, and then into something more. She'd stop by his new apartment, subsidized housing. The department had helped him secure with coffee and conversation. He'd walk her to her car after late shifts, Max trotting between them like a chaperone. 6 months after the night David saved her life, Rachel stood in front of a podium at a community center, watching him receive a civilian commendation for his work with the homeless outreach program. He'd helped solve 7 cases, prevented 3 violent crimes, and connected dozens of individuals with services. The mayor was there, the chief of police, even some folks from the homeless camps who'd cleaned up for the occasion. But the moment that made Rachel's eyes water was when a man in a Detroit Lions cap stood up in the back of the room, Detective James Anderson, Pete Morrison's former partner before David. "I came here," Anderson said, his voice carrying across the room, "to tell you all something about David Cole. This man could have exposed corruption that went to the highest levels of Detroit PD. He could have burned it all down, taken everyone with him. Instead, he walked away to protect the good cops who were left to preserve the cases Pete Morrison had solved, to ensure the victims' families got justice, even if Pete couldn't. He sacrificed everything for the badge, even when the badge failed him." The room was silent for a moment, then erupted in applause. David stood frozen, tears streaming down his face as Anderson made his way through the crowd to embrace him. "Pete would be proud," Anderson whispered loud enough for Rachel to hear. "You didn't fail him. You honored him by surviving." Later that night, after the ceremony, after the handshakes and photos and awkward small talk, Rachel found David sitting on the steps outside the community center, Max's head in his lap. "You okay?" she asked, sitting beside him. "Yeah," he said, and for the first time she believed him. "I think I actually am." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the Portland skyline light up as darkness fell. The rain had stopped, leaving the air clean and crisp, full of possibility. "Rachel," David said suddenly, "that night when you offered me your garage, why did you do it?" She thought about it for a moment. "Because you saw me. Not the uniform, not the badge. You saw me as a person worth protecting. Do you know how rare that is, to be seen, really seen by someone?" "I was just doing what was right." "No," Rachel disagreed. "You were doing what was extraordinary. Most people would have walked away, minded their own business. You chose to get involved. You chose to care." "Occupational hazard," David said with a slight smile. "Once a cop, always a cop." "Once a hero, always a hero," Rachel corrected. David shook his head. "I'm no hero. I'm just a man trying to make up for lost time." "Then keep making up for it," Rachel said, taking his hand. "With me." He looked at their intertwined fingers, then at her face, searching for something. "I'm broken, Rachel. I may never be whole again." "We're all broken," she said. "The trick is finding someone whose broken pieces fit with yours." That night, under a rare, clear Portland sky, David Cole kissed Rachel Turner. It wasn't dramatic or passionate, it was gentle, tentative, like two people learning to trust again. Max barked his approval tail, wagging furiously. A year later, at their small wedding ceremony attended by cops and homeless advocates, social workers and former addicts, all the people whose lives David had touched in his journey back from the darkness, Captain Morgan asked David what had changed his mind about taking the job. David looked at Rachel radiant in a simple white dress, then at Max wearing a bow tie that kept tilting sideways, then at all the faces of people who'd become his new family. "I realized," he said, "that redemption isn't something you achieve. It's something you practice every day, one choice at a time. Rachel taught me that. She saw something in me worth saving when I couldn't see it myself. And maybe that's all any of us need, one person who refuses to give up on us even when we've given up on ourselves." The wedding was held in the community center, where David had received his commendation. It seemed fitting, a place dedicated to bringing people together, to building bridges between different worlds. The homeless folks sat next to police officers, social workers next to former addicts in recovery. It was a testament to the unlikely coalition David had built, the lives he'd touched, simply by choosing to care. During the reception, Emma Rodriguez, the girl David had saved, now 7, and thriving, served as the flower girl. She'd insisted on being part of the wedding. When she heard about it, her parents driving up from California, where they'd moved to start fresh. "You saved me," she told David solemnly, holding his hand with her small fingers. "Now you get to be happy forever." "That's the plan, kiddo," David said, his voice thick with emotion. Detective Rodriguez, no relation to Emma, stood up to give a toast. The same man who'd been skeptical of David that first night now raised his glass with genuine warmth. "When I first met David Cole," he began, "I thought he was just another street person with delusions. I've never been happier to be wrong. This man has shown us all that heroes don't always wear capes or badges. Sometimes they wear army surplus and have dogs named Max. David, you've reminded us why we became cops in the first place, to protect and serve everyone, not just the people society deems worthy. To Rachel and David, may your partnership be as strong as your individual courage." The celebration went late into the night, but eventually the crowd thinned. David found himself standing outside again, in the same spot where he'd sat with Rachel after his commendation ceremony. This time, though, he wasn't alone. A small group had gathered, street people he'd helped, cops he'd worked with, all sharing stories and laughing. "Remember when David convinced that guy robbing the liquor store to surrender by offering him a sandwich?" someone said. "What about when Max chased down that purse snatcher and sat on him until backup arrived? My favorite was when David talked that teen runaway into calling her parents instead of getting into that sketchy van." Each story was a small victory, a life changed, a tragedy prevented. David listened, marveling at how different his life had become. 3 years ago, he'd been ready to die under a bridge, convinced his story was over. Now he was married, employed, housed, and most surprisingly happy. Rachel appeared at his elbow, still in her wedding dress, but now wearing his suit jacket against the evening chill. "No regrets?" she asked. "Only one," David said. Her face fell slightly. "What?" "That it took me so long to find you." She punched his arm lightly, then leaned into him. "Smooth talker. I learned from the best." They stood together, watching their guests mingle, two worlds that rarely intersected, now bridged by their unlikely love story. "You know," Rachel said, "Captain Morgan pulled me aside earlier. The FBI contacted her. They want to reopen the investigation into Pete Morrison's death. With Anderson's testimony and some new evidence that surfaced, they think they can finally get justice." David tensed. "I don't know if I can go through that again." "You won't be alone this time," Rachel promised. "I'll be right there with you. And if it gets dangerous, if the people who killed Pete come after us, then we face them together. That's what partners do." David thought about Pete, about the promise he'd made at his partner's grave to someday make things right. He'd thought that promise would die with him on the streets, another failure in a life full of them. but maybe, just maybe, he'd been given a second chance for a reason. "Okay," he said. "Let's do it." The investigation would take months, eventually resulting in the arrest of 3 high-ranking Detroit police officials and a city councilman. David would testify, his credibility restored by his work in Portland, his testimony crushing in its detail and precision. Pete Morrison would finally get justice, and his family would receive the full honors they'd been denied. But that was still to come. Tonight, David Cole stood with his wife, his dog, and his community, no longer invisible, no longer forgotten. He'd gone from guardian angel to guarded husband, from protector to protected, from lost to found. As the last guests departed, and he and Rachel prepared to leave for their honeymoon, a modest trip to the Oregon coast, where Max could chase seagulls and they could walk on the beach, David pulled out a worn photo from his wallet. It showed him and Pete Morrison at Pete's daughter's birthday party, both men laughing at something off camera. "I did it, Pete," he whispered. "I found my way back." Rachel squeezed his hand. "He knows," she said. "I think he's known all along." Together they walked to Rachel's car, Max jumping into the back seat with practiced ease. As they drove away from the community center, David looked back one last time at the place where his new life had truly begun. "Thank you," he said to Rachel. "For what? For seeing me when I was invisible. For believing I was worth saving." "You were never invisible to me," Rachel said. "From that first night when you stepped in front of that knife, I saw exactly who you were. A hero who'd lost his way. All I did was help you find it again." "No," David corrected. "You didn't help me find my way. You became my way." They drove in comfortable silence after that, the Portland skyline fading behind them, the promise of the ocean ahead. Max snored in the back seat, content in the knowledge that his pack was safe and together. The story that had begun with a whispered warning on a rainy night had become something neither of them could have predicted, a testament to the power of second chances, the strength found in vulnerability, and the truth that sometimes the people society discards are the very ones capable of the greatest heroism. David Cole had saved Rachel Turner's life that night, but in every way that mattered, she had saved his too. Together they'd built something beautiful from the wreckage of their separate pains, a life, a purpose, a love that transcended the boundaries society tried to impose. And in a city where it rained more often than not, where the homeless crisis seemed insurmountable, where the divide between the housed and unhoused grew wider every day, their story served as a reminder that connection was possible, that everyone deserved to be seen, and that sometimes the most unlikely partnerships produced the most extraordinary results. The rain started again as they reached the coast, but neither minded. They'd met in the rain, fallen in love in the rain, and now they'd start their married life in the rain. It seemed fitting, poetic even. "You know what I love about the rain?" David asked as they stood on the beach, Max running through the waves despite the weather. "What's that?" "It washes everything clean. Every day, a fresh start." Rachel smiled, pulling him closer. "Then here's to fresh starts. And to the people who help us make them," David added, kissing his wife as the Pacific Ocean crashed before them, and Max barked at the seagulls, chasing them through the rain with unbridled joy. Their story would continue through the FBI investigation, through David's continued work with the homeless, through Rachel's rising career in the department, through the children they would eventually adopt, 2 foster kids who, like David, just needed someone to see their worth. There would be challenges and triumphs, setbacks and victories. But it all started here with a homeless man's warning on a dark street, a split-second decision to trust, and the understanding that sometimes salvation comes from the most unexpected places. David had been right that night when he'd told Rachel she was being hunted. But what neither of them had known was that they were also hunting something themselves. Redemption connection, a reason to keep fighting in a world that often seemed hopeless. They'd found it in each other and Max, in the community they'd built from the margins of society. And in finding it, they'd proven that no one is beyond saving, no one is invisible unless we choose not to see them, and that sometimes the greatest act of heroism is simply refusing to look away. The rain continued to fall, but David and Rachel didn't move, standing together on the beach as the storm rolled in. They'd weathered worse storms separately, and now together. This one, like all the others to come, they would face as partners, as equals, as two people who had seen each other's darkest moments and chosen to be each other's light. Max finally tired of chasing birds and returned to them, shaking water everywhere, his tail still wagging, despite being thoroughly soaked. David laughed, a full, genuine laugh that Rachel had rarely heard, but treasured each time. "Come on," she said, taking his hand. "Let's get inside before we all catch pneumonia." "In a minute," David said, still looking at the ocean. "I just want to remember this moment. All of it. The rain, the waves, you, Max. The feeling of being exactly where I'm supposed to be." Rachel understood. For someone who'd spent 3 years feeling displaced, discarded, forgotten, the sensation of belonging must be overwhelming. "We have a lifetime of moments ahead of us," she reminded him. "I know," David said, "and for the first time in a very long time, I'm looking forward to every single one." The honeymoon was supposed to last a week, but on day 4, Rachel's phone rang, with a call that would change everything. She was sitting on the deck of their rented cottage, watching David teach Max to fetch driftwood, when Captain Morgan's name appeared on her screen. "Turner, I'm sorry to interrupt your honeymoon," the captain began, and Rachel could hear the tension in her voice. "But we have a situation. 3 children have gone missing in the past 48 hours, all from homeless families." Rachel's blood chilled. She looked at David, who had noticed her expression and was already walking back toward the cottage, Max at his heels. "Same perpetrator?" Rachel asked. "We think so. The patterns are too similar to be coincidental." "Rachel, we need David. The homeless community has shut down completely. They won't talk to our officers, won't cooperate with the investigation. They're terrified and they only trust him." Rachel put the phone on speaker so David could hear. His face darkened as Captain Morgan laid out the details. 3 children, ages 5 to 9, all taken from camps near the river. No witnesses willing to talk. No leads beyond some vague descriptions of a white van that may or may not exist. "We'll be there in 2 hours," David said, making the decision for both of them. The drive back to Portland was tense. David stared out the window, his jaw clenched, hands fisted in his lap. Rachel knew what he was thinking, because she was thinking it too. Children from homeless families were the most vulnerable victims possible. They existed in the margins, often undocumented, easy to disappear, without anyone in authority noticing or caring. "This is why I took the job," David said finally, "to prevent exactly this." "You can't be everywhere at once," Rachel reminded him gently. "But I should have seen it coming. There are always warning signs, someone new in the camps asking questions, people feeling uneasy. I should have been there." "You were on your honeymoon. You're allowed to have a life, David." He turned to look at her, his eyes haunted. "Not if it costs children theirs." They went straight to the station, still in their beach clothes, sand in their shoes. The briefing room was packed with officers, FBI agents, and representatives from various child welfare agencies. David was the only civilian present, but no one questioned his right to be there. The lead detective, a veteran named Patricia Chen, laid out what they knew. First victim, Maria Santos, age 7. disappeared from the camp under the Burnside Bridge Tuesday night. Her mother, undocumented, was afraid to report it for 12 hours. Second victim, Tyler Washington, age 5. Taken from the camp near Delta Park Wednesday afternoon while his grandmother was at the food bank. Third victim, Lucy Chen, no relation to me, age 9. Vanished from the Springwater Corridor camp this morning. David studied the map showing the locations. These aren't random. Whoever's doing this knows the camps, knows the schedules. Tuesday night is when Burnside gets its meal delivery from the church groups. Wednesday afternoon, the Delta Park camp is nearly empty because everyone goes to the library for the air conditioning. And Springwater this morning. That's when the social workers do their rounds. Inside knowledge, Chen asked. Or someone who's been watching for a long time, David said. I need to get out there, talk to people. We've tried, another detective interjected. They scatter the moment they see uniforms. Then I go alone, David said. No uniform, no backup, just me and Max. Absolutely not, Rachel said immediately. If someone's targeting homeless children, you could be walking into a trap. It's the only way, David insisted. These people know me, they trust me, but not if I show up with an army of cops. Captain Morgan considered this. Compromise. You go in plain clothes, but we have unmarked units stationed nearby, and you wear a wire. David nodded reluctantly. Within an hour, he was walking through the Burnside camp, Max trotting beside him, looking like any other homeless man making his rounds. But Rachel, listening through his wire from an unmarked van 2 blocks away, could hear the purpose in his voice as he greeted people he knew. Hey, Tommy, David said to an elderly veteran. Heard about Maria. Her mom must be going crazy. She left, Tommy replied. Packed up this morning, said she was heading to California. Couldn't stand being here anymore. Anyone new been around? Anyone asking questions about the kids? Tommy was quiet for a moment. Rachel could hear the sound of a shopping cart rattling past someone coughing in the distance. There's been a guy, Tommy said finally. Clean cut, too clean for the camps. Said he was from some charity wanting to help families with children. Had a clipboard, official-looking papers. When was this? Started about 2 weeks ago. Haven't seen him since Maria disappeared, though. David continued through the camp, gathering fragments of information. The man was white 30s or 40s, drove different vehicles each time he appeared. He specifically sought out families with children, offering food, clothing, even temporary housing assistance. Several people had found him unsettling, but in a world where help was rare, suspicion was often overruled by desperation. At the Delta Park camp, David found Tyler Washington's grandmother, a woman named Betty, who was barely holding herself together. He was such a good boy, she kept saying. Never caused trouble, always helped me with my things. Why would someone take him? Betty did. Anyone approach you before Tyler disappeared? Anyone offering help? Betty nodded, tears streaming down her weathered face. A man came by last week. Said he worked for a new program getting kids into better schools. Had all the right papers, knew all the right words. I told him we didn't need help, but he kept coming back. Can you describe him? White man, brown hair, had one of those faces that could be anybody. But his eyes... Betty shuddered. His eyes were cold, like he was studying us, not trying to help us. The pattern was becoming clear. The perpetrator had spent weeks infiltrating the camps, identifying targets, learning routines. This wasn't a crime of opportunity, but a carefully planned operation. At the Springwater Corridor camp, David found something that made his blood run cold. Lucy Chen's sleeping area was still intact, her few possessions undisturbed. But tucked under her pillow was a business card, Second Chances Family Services, with a phone number and website. Chen, run this immediately, Rachel said into her radio, relaying the information David had found. Within minutes, they had their answer. The business was fake, registered just 3 weeks ago to a dummy corporation. The website was professional-looking, but contained no real information. The phone number was a burner that had been disconnected. But the IP address used to create the website traced back to a warehouse in southeast Portland, the same industrial district where Emma Rodriguez had been held a year ago. "We need to move now," Captain Morgan decided. "Get SWAT ready. David, get back here." "Wait," David said over the wire. "I'm seeing something." Through his wire, Rachel could hear Max growling. Then David's voice, tense but controlled. "White van license plate covered with mud, just pulled up to the camp. Driver matches the description. David, do not engage. Get out of there now." But David was already moving. Rachel could hear his footsteps, quickening, Max's growls getting louder. "He's approaching a family," David reported. "Mother with 2 kids, they arrived yesterday from Seattle." "All units converge on Springwater Corridor," Captain Morgan commanded. "Silent approach, no sirens." Rachel was already running to a patrol car, her heart pounding. They were 5 minutes out, maybe 4 if they pushed it. But a lot could happen in 4 minutes. Through the wire, she heard David's voice, louder now, calling out, "Hey, brother, long time no see." The sound of footsteps stopping. A man's voice, cautious. "I think you have me confused with someone else." No, I'd recognize you anywhere." David continued, his tone friendly but insistent. "From the Seattle mission, right? You were working with Father Miguel." Rachel recognized the tactic. David was creating a scene, making it impossible for the man to quietly leave with potential victims. "You're mistaken," the man said, his voice harder now. "Max, say hello," David commanded, and Rachel could hear the dog barking enthusiastically. "He remembers you too." More people were gathering now, drawn by the commotion. The man couldn't grab children with dozens of witnesses watching. But he also couldn't leave without raising suspicion. "I need to go," the man said. "Oh, come on, stay for coffee. Betty makes the best camp coffee in Portland." "Betty? Come meet my friend from Seattle." Rachel's patrol car screeched around the corner just as the man made his move. Through the wire, she heard a scuffle, Max snarling, David shouting. By the time she reached the camp, a crowd had formed around 2 figures on the ground. David had the man pinned, one knee on his back, the man's arm twisted behind him. Max stood guard, teeth bared, ready to attack if the man moved. The white van sat abandoned, driver's door still open. "About time you got here," David said as Rachel approached. "This gentleman was just leaving, but I convinced him to stay." The man was Marcus Fitzgerald, a former child services worker who'd been fired 5 years ago for inappropriate conduct with minors. He'd spent the intervening years moving from state to state, always managing to stay just ahead of the law. But he'd made a mistake coming to Portland, to David's territory. The white van contained zip-ties, sedatives, and a map with 3 addresses circled, all in rural Washington. When the FBI raided the first address, they found the 3 missing children scared and hungry, but physically unharmed. Fitzgerald had been planning to sell them to a trafficking ring operating out of Seattle. The rescue made national news. David once again was pushed into a spotlight he didn't want. But this time he handled it differently. He used the attention to advocate for better services for homeless families, for more resources dedicated to protecting the most vulnerable children. These kids were targeted because the system failed them first, he said at a press conference, Rachel standing proudly beside him. They were invisible to everyone except the predators. That has to change. The case became a catalyst for reform. Portland implemented new protocols for missing children from homeless families, including immediate Amber Alerts, regardless of documentation status. David's role expanded, his team grew, and soon he was consulting with cities across the country on how to better protect their homeless populations. But success came with a price. David started receiving threats, anonymous messages warning him to back off. Someone spray-painted "pig" on the door of his apartment. Max was nearly poisoned when someone left tainted meat near their usual walking route. "Maybe we should consider moving," Rachel suggested one night after finding their car tires slashed for the second time in a month. David shook his head. "That's what they want. For us to run to hide, to stop caring. I'm not talking about stopping. I'm talking about staying alive long enough to continue the fight." Before David could respond, his phone rang. The number was blocked, but he answered anyway. "Hello, David?" a familiar voice said. "It's been a long time." David's face went white. Rachel watched as his hand began to shake. "Who is it?" she whispered. David put the phone on speaker. "Thomas Brennan," he said. "The killer from Detroit." "Very good." Brennan's voice was smooth, cultured. Nothing like what you'd expect from a serial killer. "I heard you've been making quite a name for yourself in Portland. Saving children, catching bad guys. Playing hero. What do you want, Brennan?" "Just to congratulate you, and to let you know I'll be visiting your lovely city soon. I have some unfinished business there. If you come near what your wife, your dog, all those helpless, homeless people you care so much about." "Don't worry, David. I'm not interested in them. I'm interested in you. You're the one who got away, the loose end I never tied up." The line went dead. Rachel immediately called dispatch, requesting a trace on the call, increased patrols around their apartment, protection details. But David just sat there staring at the phone. "He killed Pete's family," he said quietly. "Tortured them first. Made Pete listen on the phone while he did it." "That won't happen here," Rachel said firmly. "We know he's coming. We'll be ready." "You don't understand. Brennan isn't just a killer. He's connected, protected. He has people everywhere. The reason the Detroit investigation fell apart wasn't just corruption. It was fear. Everyone who tried to stop him ended up dead or destroyed. Then we stop him together. Portland PD, FBI, everyone. He can't fight all of us." David looked at her with such sadness that Rachel's heart broke. That's what Pete thought too. The next few weeks were tense. David threw himself into his work with manic intensity, barely sleeping, constantly checking and rechecking security measures. Rachel watched him deteriorate, the old demons creeping back. She found empty whiskey bottles hidden in the garage, caught him staring at nothing, with the 1,000-yard stare she recognized from other cops who'd seen too much. Then one rainy Tuesday night, exactly 1 year after David had saved Rachel's life, Brennan made his move. Rachel was working a late shift when the call came in. A body had been found under the Morrison Bridge, David's old sleeping spot. But it wasn't David. It was James Anderson, the Detroit detective who'd spoken at David's commendation ceremony. Pinned to Anderson's chest was a note, 1 down, 2 to go. "Your move, David." Rachel raced home to find their apartment empty. David's gun was gone, so was Max. On the kitchen counter was a letter in David's handwriting. "Rachel, I'm sorry. I can't let Brennan hurt anyone else because of me. This ends tonight, one way or another. If something happens to me, know that this past year with you has been worth everything. You saved me in every way a person can be saved. I love you. Take care of Max if he makes it back without me. David." Rachel's hands shook as she called Captain Morgan. "David's gone after Brennan alone." "How do you know where—" "The warehouse," Rachel interrupted. "Where Emma Rodriguez was held, where Fitzgerald was traced to. It's always been about that warehouse. That's where this will end. 20 units responded to the call. FBI, SWAT, even officers from neighboring jurisdictions who'd heard David's story and wanted to help. They surrounded the warehouse, a massive structure that had once housed a furniture manufacturing plant, but had been abandoned for years. Rachel, wearing tactical gear despite orders to stay back, was with the first team to breach. The warehouse was dark, filled with shadows and the ghosts of old machinery. They found Max first locked in an office, barking frantically and clawing at the door. When released, he immediately ran deeper into the building, the teams following. They heard voices before they saw anything. Brennan's cultured tones and David's rougher voice engaged in what sounded almost like a philosophical debate. "You became everything you once fought against," Brennan was saying. "A broken man, a failure, a cautionary tale." "Maybe," David replied, "but I also became something you'll never be. Human. Humanity is weakness. Look where it got your partner. Look where it got you. It got me a second chance, a wife who loves me, a purpose, friends who would die for me just like I'd die for them. What do you have, Brennan? Money, power, fear? That's not living. That's just existence." Rachel peered around a corner and saw them. David stood in an open area, his gun pointed at Brennan, who sat casually on a crate, seemingly unconcerned about the weapon aimed at his chest. Between them lay Anderson's service weapon, like a challenge or an invitation. "You could have killed me in Detroit," Brennan said. "Why didn't you?" "Because I'm not you. I don't execute people no matter what they've done." "Noble. Stupid, but noble. That's why you'll lose, David. Because you have rules. Lines you won't cross. I have no such limitations." That's when Rachel saw it, a glint of metal in the shadows behind David. Another person, weapon raised. Without thinking, she shouted, "David, behind you!" Everything happened at once. David spun, firing at the second shooter. Brennan lunged for Anderson's gun. Rachel and the other officers burst from cover. The warehouse erupted in gunfire. When the smoke cleared, Brennan was on the ground, clutching his shoulder, alive but incapacitated. His accomplice, a corrupt Portland detective who'd been feeding him information, was dead. And David was standing, swaying slightly, blood seeping from a graze on his temple. "You okay?" Rachel asked, rushing to him. "Yeah," he said, then looked at Brennan. "It's over." "Is it?" Brennan smiled despite his pain. "I have lawyers' connections. I'll be out in 5 years, maybe less, and then we'll do this all again." "No," said a new voice. FBI Special Agent Sarah Chen, no relation to Detective Chesterton, stepped forward. "Thomas Brennan, you're under arrest for federal racketeering, murder for hire, and corruption charges that span 5 states. You're not getting out. Ever." As they led Brennan away, David collapsed against Rachel, the adrenaline finally leaving his system. "You came for me," he said. "Of course I did. That's what partners do." The aftermath was complicated. The investigation revealed corruption in Portland's department. 3 officers who'd been on Brennan's payroll. David testified in multiple trials, reliving the trauma of Detroit, while helping to ensure justice was finally served. Pete Morrison's family received full honors and compensation. The officers who'd participated in the cover-up were arrested. But through it all, David remained steady. The confrontation with Brennan had changed. Something in him closed a chapter that had been left bleeding for too long. He didn't touch alcohol again, threw himself into his work with renewed purpose, and slowly began to build the life he'd thought he'd lost forever. 6 months after Brennan's arrest, Rachel found David at the Morrison Bridge, looking down at the spot where he used to sleep. Max sat beside him, tail wagging slowly. Remembering, she asked. Appreciating, David corrected. If I hadn't ended up here, I never would have met you, never would have found my way back. Everything happens for a reason. No, David said. Most things happen for no reason at all. But we get to choose what we do with what happens to us. We get to choose whether we let it destroy us or whether we use it to become something better. They stood together looking at the city lights reflected in the river. Portland continued its eternal rain, washing the streets clean, creating mud and mess and inconvenience, but also creating life growth renewal. I have something to tell you, Rachel said. David turned to look at her, concern immediately crossing his features. Are you okay? I'm pregnant. The expression on David's face went through several transformations. Shock, fear, joy, terror, and finally wonder. Really? Really? About 8 weeks. I found out this morning. David pulled her into his arms, holding her like she might disappear if he let go. A baby, he whispered. We're having a baby. Are you happy? Happy doesn't even begin to cover it. Terrified, overwhelmed, grateful, ecstatic. He pulled back to look at her face. What about you? All of the above, but mostly happy. We're building something here, David. A family, a life, a future. From the ashes of our pasts. From the ashes of our pasts, Rachel agreed. They walked back to their car, Max trotting between them, and drove home to the house they'd bought 3 months ago, a fixer-upper in a neighborhood full of families and hope and possibility. The garage where David had first stayed was now his workshop, where he built furniture and fixed things and created beauty from salvaged materials. That night, as they lay in bed planning for a future neither of them could have imagined. A year ago, David's phone rang. Captain Morgan's voice was apologetic but urgent. David, I'm sorry to call so late, but we have a situation. A trafficking ring operating out of Seattle has taken 12 children from homeless camps across 3 states. The FBI is requesting your help. You're the only one who understands how these predators think, how they operate in the margins. David looked at Rachel, who nodded despite her fear. This was who he was now, who they were. The ones who stood between the predators and the prey, between the darkness and the innocent. I'll be there in 20 minutes, David said. As he got dressed, Rachel watched him transform from her husband into the detective he'd always been, the protector he'd never stopped being, even in his darkest moments. Be careful, she said. Always. I have too much to live for now. He placed his hand on her still flat stomach. Both of you. The case would take 2 weeks to solve, result in 37 arrests, and save not just the 12 children, but dozens more who were being groomed for future abduction. David's methods, his ability to think like both predator and protector, his understanding of the invisible populations made him invaluable. When he returned home exhausted but victorious, he found Rachel had transformed their spare bedroom into a nursery. The walls were painted a soft green, gender-neutral and hopeful. A crib stood in the corner, the mobile above it featuring tiny police badges and German shepherds and stars. Too much? Rachel asked nervously. Perfect, David said, pulling her close. Their daughter was born on a rare sunny day in Portland, 7 pounds of screaming perfection, who immediately wrapped her father around her tiny finger. They named her Hope Patricia Cole after Pete Morrison's daughter, and everything David had found in his second chance at life. Max appointed himself Hope's guardian, sleeping by her crib, alerting David and Rachel to every cry, every need. The dog who'd saved David from the streets now protected the next generation, the cycle of salvation continuing. When Hope was 3 months old, Portland held a ceremony honoring David's unit's work. They'd solved 23 cases, saved 41 children, and created a model that cities across the country were adopting. David stood at the podium, Hope in his arms, Rachel and Max beside him, and looked out at a crowd that included police officers, social workers, and dozens of formerly homeless individuals who'd been helped by his programs. 3 years ago, I was sleeping under a bridge, he began. I thought my story was over. I thought I had nothing left to offer the world. But I learned something important. Redemption isn't a destination. It's a journey. And it's one we don't take alone. He looked at Rachel, who smiled through tears, then at Hope, who was gumming his badge with determination. Every person deserves a second chance. Every child deserves protection. Every forgotten soul deserves to be seen. That's not just my mission anymore. It's our mission. All of us together, refusing to look away from the margins, refusing to let the vulnerable be prey, refusing to give up on each other, even when we've given up on ourselves. The applause was thunderous, but David barely heard it. He was watching a man in the back of the room, a familiar figure in an army surplus jacket with a dog at his feet. Another lost soul, another potential story of redemption. After the ceremony, David approached the man. "I'm David," he said, extending his hand. "That's a nice dog you've got there." "Charlie," the man said warily. "And this is Duke." "Charlie, have you eaten today?" When the man shook his head, David smiled. "Well, that's going to change. Come on, my wife makes the best sandwiches in Portland, and I know Duke would love to meet Max." Charlie turned out to be a former Marine 2 tours in Afghanistan, who'd come home to find his wife had left and taken their son. The VA had failed him, the system had failed him, and he'd ended up on Portland's streets, just like David had, carrying wounds both visible and invisible. But unlike David's first nights under the bridge, Charlie had someone watching out for him from the start. David brought Charlie home that evening, and Rachel didn't even blink when her husband walked through the door with another lost soul. She'd gotten used to it by now, the way David collected broken people like some collected stamps. Their house had become an unofficial way station for those transitioning from the streets to stability. Hope's going to grow up thinking it's normal to have random homeless veterans sleeping in our garage, Rachel said that night, watching through the window as Charlie settled into the same space David had occupied 2 years ago. "Is that such a bad thing?" David asked, bouncing their daughter on his knee. "She'll grow up knowing that everyone deserves dignity, that everyone has a story worth hearing. She'll grow up knowing her father can't say no to anyone in need." Rachel corrected, but her tone was fond. The next morning brought crisis. David's phone rang at 5 a.m., Captain Morgan's voice tight with urgency. A homeless camp near the rail yards had been torched during the night. 3 dead, dozens injured, and witnesses claimed they'd seen men in uniforms before the fire started. "Uniforms?" David asked, already pulling on his clothes. "That's what they're saying. Police uniforms. David, this is going to explode if it's true. The community already barely trusts us. If cops were involved in burning out a homeless camp..." David arrived at the scene to find chaos. Fire trucks, ambulances, news vans, and a growing crowd of angry homeless individuals convinced the police had finally decided to solve the homeless problem with violence. The camp was still smoldering, the acrid smell of burned plastic and despair hanging in the air. "David." A woman ran up to him, her face streaked with soot and tears. It was Martha, one of his regular contacts, a grandmother who'd been on the streets for 5 years. "They came in the middle of the night, 4 of them wearing police uniforms. They poured gasoline everywhere, told us we had 2 minutes to get out, then lit it up." "Did you recognize any of them?" David asked. Martha shook her head. "They wore masks like for COVID, but covering more of their faces. But David, they had badges, guns, everything. They were real cops." David didn't think so. Something about this felt wrong, staged. Real cops conducting an illegal operation wouldn't wear their uniforms, wouldn't leave witnesses. This was meant to be seen, meant to cause exactly the chaos that was now unfolding. He found Rachel at the perimeter, trying to keep the media back. "It wasn't cops," he told her quietly. "How do you know?" "Because cops would have done it smarter. This is someone trying to start a war between the homeless and the police. The question is why?" The answer came 3 hours later when the first body was discovered in an abandoned building 5 blocks away. A young woman homeless murdered while everyone's attention was on the fire. Then another body and another. By noon, they'd found 5 victims, all killed during the chaos of the fire response. "A diversion," Detective Chen said, surveying the 5th crime scene. "The fire was to draw all our resources away, create confusion, make the homeless community distrust us so they wouldn't report the murders." David studied the victim, a woman in her 30s with track marks on her arms. Something about the positioning of the body nagged at him familiar in a way that made his stomach turn. "I've seen this before," he said slowly. "The way she's positioned, the type of victim. Detroit, 2019. We had a serial killer who targeted homeless women, especially addicts. He'd pose them like this, like they were sleeping." "The case Pete Morrison was working when he died?" Rachel asked. David nodded, his face grim. "We caught Thomas Brennan for those murders, but there were always questions. The killing stopped when we arrested him, but some of the murders never quite fit his pattern. We thought maybe he had a partner, someone who kept killing after Brennan was arrested, but we could never prove it." "And now that partner is in Portland?" Chen asked. "Maybe. Or maybe it's a copycat. Either way, they're using Brennan's arrest as cover. Everyone thinks that case is closed, so no one's looking for connections." The next 72 hours were a blur of investigation. David worked 18-hour days, using his network to gather information the official investigation couldn't access. Charlie, still staying in their garage, proved unexpectedly helpful, his military background giving him insights into the tactical planning behind the fake police raid. "This was military precision," Charlie told David, studying the crime scene photos. "The timing, the coordination, the way they moved through the camp. These aren't street criminals. They're trained." That observation led to a breakthrough. Security footage from a nearby building showed one of the fake cops had a distinctive tattoo on his wrist, partially visible when his glove rode up. It was a Special Forces insignia with modifications that suggested a particular unit that had served in Iraq in 2007. "I know that unit," Charlie said when he saw the enhanced image. "Bad news. Half of them were dishonorably discharged after a scandal involving murdered civilians. They came back stateside and scattered, but rumors were they stayed in touch, worked as mercenaries." The investigation shifted focus, FBI resources flooding in as the case expanded beyond Portland. The murdered homeless women weren't random victims, but witnesses to something bigger. Each had been in Detroit during Brennan's killing spree. Each had information that someone desperately wanted to keep buried. Rachel found the connection while going through old case files at 2 a.m. Hope sleeping in a bassinet beside her desk. "David, look at this." All 5 victims were listed as potential witnesses in a case that was sealed after Brennan's arrest. A case involving human trafficking that used homeless women as mules and victims. "Someone's cleaning house," David realized, eliminating anyone who could testify if the case was ever reopened. But who would even know these women were here? They've been in Portland for years, living under different names. The answer came from an unexpected source. Marcus Fitzgerald, the child trafficker David had caught months earlier, offered information in exchange for a reduced sentence. He claimed to know who was hunting the homeless women, said it was the same organization he'd been planning to sell the kidnapped children to. They call themselves the Circuit, Fitzgerald said, sitting in an interrogation room with his lawyer David and FBI agents. They move people, drugs, weapons, anything profitable. They use the homeless because no one notices when they disappear. The women you found, they weren't just witnesses. They were escaped products. David felt sick. Products. The Circuit grabbed them in Detroit, used them as drug mules and worse. But when Brennan got arrested and the heat came down, some of them escaped. The Circuit's been hunting them ever since, tying up loose ends. Who runs the Circuit? The FBI agent demanded. Fitzgerald shook his head. I only dealt with middlemen, but I heard rumors. Someone high up in law enforcement, someone with access to sealed records and witness protection lists. The investigation turned inward, focusing on corrupted officials with ties to both Detroit and Portland. David found himself investigating cops he'd worked with, people he'd trusted. The paranoia was suffocating, not knowing who was friend or enemy. Then hope was threatened. The message came through their home phone at 3 a.m., a digitally altered voice that could have been anyone. Back off, Cole, or your daughter pays the price. You've already lost one family. Don't lose another. David stood in his daughter's nursery, watching her sleep peacefully, Max curled up beneath her crib. Rachel stood beside him, her hand on her service weapon, even in their own home. We could send Hope away, Rachel suggested. My parents in California. No, David said firmly. We don't run. We don't hide. We end this. The next day, David did something that went against every protocol. He held a press conference standing on the steps of City Hall with Rachel Hope in her arms and Max at their feet. My name is David Cole, he began. 3 years ago, I was homeless, sleeping under bridges, forgotten by society. Today, I stand here as proof that everyone deserves a second chance, that redemption is possible. But there are those who profit from keeping people in the shadows, who see the vulnerable as commodities to be exploited. He looked directly at the cameras. To the Circuit, to whoever is killing these women, I have a message. You threatened my daughter. That was your first mistake. Your second was thinking I'd back down. I've lost everything before and survived. I've been to the bottom and clawed my way back. You think you know me because you've read my file, but you don't know what a man becomes when he's been broken and rebuilt. David held up a flash drive. This contains everything we know about the Circuit. Names, dates, connections. It's been sent to every major news outlet, the FBI, the Justice Department, and backed up in places you'll never find. You have 48 hours to surrender. After that, we hunt you down like you've hunted these innocent women. The press conference sent shockwaves through the law enforcement community. David's phone rang non-stop with calls from superiors furious about his grandstanding, but also from whistleblowers offering information, inspired by his courage or terrified of being implicated. That night, as David and Rachel prepared for whatever retaliation might come, Charlie knocked on their door. He wasn't alone. 6 other veterans, all homeless, all armed, stood behind him. We heard about the threat to your family, Charlie said simply. We're here to help. David looked at these men, society's discarded warriors, offering to protect his family. I can't ask you to. You're not asking, Charlie interrupted. We're volunteering. You gave us dignity when everyone else saw trash. Now we've got your 6. For the next 2 days, David's house became a fortress. Veterans patrolled the perimeter, Rachel's fellow officers took shifts watching the street, and Max seemed to be everywhere at once, his protective instincts in overdrive. Hope, oblivious to the danger, giggled and played the center of a protective circle she couldn't see. On the second night they came. David was in the kitchen going over case files when Max started growling. Not his normal alert bark, but a deep primal growl that David had only heard once before, the night Brennan had called. They're here, Charlie's voice crackled over the radio they'd set up. 3 vehicles approaching from different directions. Rachel appeared from the bedroom vest on weapon ready. Hope, safe room, David confirmed. They'd converted a closet into a reinforced panic room, Hope sleeping peacefully inside with 2 officers guarding the door. The attack came from 3 directions simultaneously. Professional coordinated the kind of assault that would have overwhelmed a normal home's defenses. But this wasn't a normal home anymore. This was a gathering of warriors, cops, and veterans united in purpose. The first wave hit Charlie's position at the garage. The former Marine and his companions responded with military precision, laying down suppressing fire that stopped the attackers cold. The second wave tried to breach the back door only to find Rachel and 3 officers waiting. The third wave, attempting to come through the windows, met David and Max. The firefight lasted less than 3 minutes, but felt like hours. When the smoke cleared, 12 attackers were down, 4 dead, the rest wounded and captured. None of David's defenders had been killed, though 2 veterans had been injured and were being treated by paramedics. Among the captured was someone David recognized, though it took him a moment to place the face. Assistant Chief Harold Morrison from Portland PD, no relation to Pete Morrison, despite the shared surname. He'd been David's supporter, had pushed for him to get the consultant position. "Why?" David asked, standing over Morrison as EMTs worked on his gunshot wound. Morrison laughed bitterly. "You really don't get it, do you? The circuit isn't just some criminal organization. It's a system decades old, threading through every major city. We don't just move products. We control the margins, the invisible people. The homeless are perfect cover for everything. You burned that camp, killed those women. I gave the orders, just like I've been giving orders for years. You think you've won because you caught me. I'm just middle management. The circuit will continue long after I'm gone." "Maybe," David said, "but not in Portland. Not on my watch." The arrests that followed were stunning in scope. 17 officers, 3 judges, numerous city officials, all connected to the circuit. The FBI task force, now trusting David completely, used his intelligence to coordinate raids across 5 states. The circuit's Pacific Northwest operation collapsed within weeks. But victory came with a cost. David and his family couldn't stay in Portland, not with the remnants of the circuit still out there seeking revenge. Captain Morgan arranged for David to join a federal task force working to dismantle human trafficking networks nationwide. It meant leaving the city where he'd found redemption, the streets where he'd rebuilt his life. Their last night in Portland, David stood once again at the Morrison Bridge, looking down at where he used to sleep. Rachel stood beside him, Hope in a carrier against her chest, Max at their feet. Charlie was there too, now clean-shaven, and employed running the homeless outreach program David had started. "You saved this city," Charlie said. "This city saved me first," David replied. As they prepared to leave for their new life in witness protection with new identities and federal protection, David received one last visitor. Betty Washington Tyler's grandmother, the boy who'd been kidnapped and rescued. She handed David a small package. "Tyler made this for you," she said. Inside was a hand-drawn picture. It showed a stick figure with a badge standing next to a dog protecting smaller figures labeled "Us." At the bottom, in a child's careful printing, were the words, "Thank you for seeing us when we were invisible." David carefully folded the picture and placed it in his wallet next to the old photo of Pete Morrison and his family. The federal marshal arrived at midnight, a bland sedan that would take them to their new life. As they drove away from Portland, David looked back one last time at the city lights reflecting off the river. He'd arrived here broken and lost, ready to die. He was leaving whole with a family, a purpose, and the knowledge that redemption was not only possible, but worth fighting for. "Where are we going?" Rachel asked the marshal. Seattle initially, the marshal replied. Then to wherever the task force needs you. There are trafficking networks in every major city, homeless populations being exploited everywhere. Your husband's unique skills are desperately needed. David reached over and took Rachel's hand. Ready for a new adventure. As long as we're together, she replied. Then looked down at Hope, who was reaching for Max's nose. All of us. The sedan disappeared into the night, carrying a family forged in crisis, bonded by purpose, and committed to fighting for those society preferred to forget. Behind them, Portland continued its existence. Rain washing the streets clean, the homeless camps slowly rebuilding with better protection and support thanks to the systems David had put in place. Charlie stood at the bridge until the car's taillights disappeared, then walked back to the shelter he now managed. There was work to do, people to help, invisible souls to see and protect. David Cole might be gone, but his mission continued through those he'd inspired, a legacy of redemption that would ripple through the margins of society for years to come. 6 months later, news would filter back to Portland about a mysterious consultant helping the Seattle PD solve a series of murders targeting homeless veterans. The consultant was described only as a middle-aged man with a German shepherd, someone who seemed to understand the streets in a way that suggested personal experience. Charlie smiled when he heard the report, knowing David was out there, still fighting, still protecting those who couldn't protect themselves. The rain continued to fall on Portland, washing away the blood and pain of recent events, nurturing new growth in the cracks of a broken system. And somewhere in those cracks, in the spaces between visible and invisible, hope persisted. Not the kind of hope that ignores harsh realities, but the kind that emerges from them, that says, redemption is possible, second chances are worth fighting for, and sometimes the greatest heroes are those who've fallen the furthest and chosen to rise again. In Seattle, in a modest apartment under names that weren't their own, David Cole tucked his daughter into bed, while Rachel reviewed case files and Max kept watch. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new predators to stop, new victims to save. But tonight, they were together, they were safe, and they were proof that even the darkest stories can find light if someone is brave enough to look for it. Daddy, Hope said sleepily, her vocabulary growing every day. Tell me about the bridge. David sat on the edge of her bed, considering how to tell a toddler about rock bottom and redemption. Once upon a time, he began. There was a man who thought he was invisible. He lived under a bridge and believed no one could see him. But then he met a police officer who needed help, and he discovered that being invisible sometimes means you can see things others can't. Like what? Hope asked. Like who really needs help? Like who's pretending to be good but isn't? Like how to protect people who think no one cares about them. Was the man you, Daddy? David smiled, kissing his daughter's forehead. Maybe. Or maybe he was everyone who's ever felt invisible and chose to help anyway. Hope seemed satisfied with that answer, closing her eyes and drifting off to sleep. David sat there a moment longer, watching her breathe, marveling at the journey that had brought him from a rain-soaked bridge to this moment of perfect peace. Rachel appeared in the doorway. New case just came in. 3 missing teenagers, all from homeless families. David nodded, standing carefully so as not to wake Hope. Let me review the files. As they worked side by side at their kitchen table, Max alert at their feet, David thought about the circular nature of his story. He'd been saved so he could save others, been seen so he could see the invisible, been given a second chance so he could offer the same to those who'd given up hope. The work would never be done. There would always be predators, always be vulnerable populations, always be those who profited from human misery. But there would also always be those willing to stand against them, to bridge the gap between society's margins and its center, to insist that every life had value. Outside Seattle's rain began to fall so similar to Portland's that David could almost pretend nothing had changed. But everything had changed. He was no longer David Cole, homeless detective, drinking himself to death under a bridge. He was something new, something forged in crisis and tempered by love. He was proof that the worst endings could become new beginnings, that the deepest falls could lead to the highest purposes. "You okay?" Rachel asked, noticing his distant expression. "Yeah," David said, returning to the case files. "Just thinking about circles and bridges and the strange ways life connects things." "Very philosophical for a Tuesday night," Rachel teased. "Must be the rain," David replied, then focused on the task at hand. 3 missing teenagers who needed finding families, who needed reuniting, predators who needed stopping. It was his purpose now, his redemption played out in every life saved, every predator caught, every invisible soul made visible again. The night stretched ahead, full of work and purpose, and the quiet satisfaction of doing what others couldn't or wouldn't do. And somewhere in Portland, Charlie stood on the Morrison Bridge looking down at the spot where David Cole had once slept, and whispered a prayer of gratitude for second chances and the people brave enough to offer them. The 3 missing teenagers turned out to be the tip of an iceberg that would consume the next 2 years of David's life. What started as a routine investigation in Seattle revealed a network that made the circuit look amateur by comparison. The teenagers hadn't been taken for trafficking or ransom. They'd been recruited, promised jobs and housing, only to disappear into what the FBI would later call the Shadow Railroad, a system that moved vulnerable youth across state lines for purposes that made David's stomach turn every time he thought about it. The first break came when one of the teenagers, a 16-year-old named Marcus, managed to escape and call 911 from a gas station payphone in Montana. By the time David and Rachel arrived with the task force, Marcus was barely coherent, drugged and traumatized, but alive. What he told them changed everything. "They said they were helping us," Marcus whispered in the hospital room, his eyes unfocused. "Said they had jobs in tech companies, places where our past didn't matter. They had websites, testimonials, everything looked real. But when we got to the facility, as Marcus called it, was a compound in rural Montana where homeless youth were being used as test subjects for experimental drugs. Not official trials, but black market testing for compounds that legitimate pharmaceutical companies wouldn't touch. The subjects were perfect victims, people who wouldn't be missed, whose deaths could be explained away as overdoses or exposure. David felt the familiar rage, building the same feeling he'd had when he'd found Emma Rodriguez in that warehouse, when he'd faced Brennan. But now it was tempered with something else, a cold calculation that came from 2 years of hunting predators. He didn't just want to save the current victims. He wanted to destroy the entire system. Rachel watched him change during those weeks in Montana, saw the last vestiges of the broken man under the bridge disappear completely. In its place was something harder, but not cruel, focused, but not obsessed. He'd found the balance that had eluded him in Detroit, the ability to do the work without letting it consume him. The compound raid happened on a frozen morning in December. David insisted on being part of the tactical team despite his consultant status. The FBI had learned to trust his instincts, his ability to predict how predators thought, where they'd hide their victims. "They'll have a kill switch," David told the team leader. "Something to eliminate evidence if they're raided. We need to secure the medical wing first. That's where the test subjects will be." He was right. The moment the FBI breached, the perimeter alarms sounded throughout the compound. Security forces engaged the tactical teams, while inside technicians scrambled to destroy computer drives and documents. But David had anticipated this too. A second team, following his planned route through maintenance tunnels Marcus had described, had reached the medical wing before the kill protocols could be activated. 23 youth were rescued that day, aged 14 to 19, all homeless or runaways, all promised better lives, and delivered into nightmare. The compound's director, a former CDC researcher named Dr. Patricia Vance, was captured trying to flee through a back exit David had insisted on covering. "You don't understand," Vance said, as they led her away. "We were doing important work. These kids were dying on the streets anyway. At least this way their lives meant something." David stepped close to her, his voice low and dangerous. "Their lives already meant something. You just couldn't see it." The investigation that followed revealed the Shadow Railroad's true scope. Dozens of facilities across the country, hundreds of victims over the past decade, connections to major pharmaceutical companies who maintained plausible deniability while benefiting from the illegal research. It was overwhelming, the kind of case that could consume a career, a life. But David had learned balance. Every night, no matter how late the investigation ran, he made time for Hope. He'd video call from whatever city the case had taken him to, reading her bedtime stories, listening to her talk about her day. Rachel had returned to Portland temporarily with Hope, the witness protection making her continued fieldwork impossible, but they maintained their connection across the miles. "Daddy, when are you coming home?" Hope asked one night, her face pixelated on the laptop screen. "Soon, sweetheart. Daddy just has to help some more kids first." "Like you helped me." David paused. Hope was too young to fully understand her history, the danger she'd been in as an infant. But somehow she knew her father's work involved protecting children. "Yes, like I helped you." "Okay. Max misses you. He keeps looking at your chair." The image of Max loyal even in absence made David's chest tight. The dog was getting older, gray creeping into his muzzle, his movements a little slower. Time was passing, life was happening, and David was missing it for the work. That night, he made a decision. After the Shadow Railroad case concluded, he would step back from fieldwork. Hope needed a father present, not just a hero in distant cities. Rachel needed a husband, not just a voice on the phone. And Max, faithful Max, who'd walked every step of this journey with him, deserved to spend his remaining years with his pack complete. The Shadow Railroad investigation climaxed 6 months later in a coordinated operation that spanned 12 states. David had spent those months building profiles, predicting movements, identifying the key players who kept the system running. His homeless network, now national in scope, provided intelligence no official agency could have gathered. The night before the raids, David stood in a Chicago hotel room, looking out at the city lights. Tomorrow would likely be his last major operation. He thought about Pete Morrison, about the promises made, and kept about the long road from Detroit's failure to this moment of potential triumph. Rachel called as he stood there. "Can't sleep. Just thinking. About circles completing. About debts being paid. About coming home." "We'll be here," Rachel assured him. "Hope's been drawing pictures of the four of us. She's gotten quite good. You almost have a neck in the latest one." David laughed, the sound surprising him with its genuineness. When had he become someone who could laugh so easily again? The raids went down at dawn. 117 arrests, 341 victims rescued, evidence that would fuel prosecutions for years. David was there for the main target, a billionaire named Harrison Cross, who'd funded the Shadow Railroad as his personal medical research project. Cross was eating breakfast in his penthouse when they arrived, seemingly unconcerned by the FBI agents flooding his home. "Mr. Cole," he said, recognizing David despite never having met him. "The famous homeless detective. You know we're not so different. We both see the invisible people, We just have different uses for them. We're nothing alike, David replied. No. You use them for information, for building your reputation, for making yourself feel like a hero. I use them for medical advancement. At least my exploitation has the potential to benefit humanity. David wanted to hit him, could feel his fists clenching. But then he thought of Hope, of the father he wanted to be, versus the man he'd been. The only difference between us, David said calmly, is that I see them as human. You see them as resources. That's not a small distinction. It's everything. Cross was led away in handcuffs, his empire crumbling, his legacy destroyed. The Shadow Railroad was done. David flew back to Seattle that night, but not to the safe house where the marshals had placed them. Rachel met him at a different address, a modest 2-story house in a quiet neighborhood where nobody would look twice at a family with a dog. Our new home, she said, showing him around. The task force pulled strings. We can use our real names again. The threats have been assessed as minimal. We can have a normal life. Normal. David wasn't sure he knew what that meant anymore. But as Hope ran into his arms, as Max nearly knocked him over with enthusiasm, as Rachel kissed him with tears in her eyes, he thought maybe normal was just this being present for the people who loved him. They settled into a routine that felt foreign and wonderful. David took a position with Seattle PD as a consultant, but strictly office hours, no field work. He developed training programs for identifying and helping at-risk youth, his methods becoming standard practice across the Pacific Northwest. Rachel returned to active duty, their schedules coordinated, so someone was always home with Hope. It was during this period of supposed normalcy that the past returned in the most unexpected way. David was walking Max in a park near their home when he saw her. A woman sitting on a bench, thin and weathered but familiar, in a way that made his heart stop. Sarah Cole, his ex-wife. She looked up as he approached, recognition dawning slowly. David. My God. David. They stared at each other across the gulf of years and pain. The last time they'd spoken, David had been deep in alcoholic despair, their divorce final, their children turned against him by his failures. Sarah, what are you doing in Seattle? I live here now, have for a year. She looked at Max, older but still recognizable. That's the same dog from the news stories. You really were the homeless detective who saved all those kids. How are Michael and Jennifer? David asked about their children, now adults he hadn't seen in 4 years. Sarah's face softened. They know about what you've done. They've followed your story. Michael especially, he's been thinking about reaching out. But they're scared. You disappeared so completely, became someone else. They don't know if you want them in your new life. David sat down beside his ex-wife, Max, settling at his feet. I think about them every day, but I didn't know how to explain what I'd become, what I'd done. How do you tell your children their father lived under a bridge? How do you explain choosing the streets over fighting for them? You tell them the truth, Sarah said simply. That you were sick, that you got better, that you never stopped loving them, even when you couldn't love yourself. They talked for an hour, filling in gaps, sharing stories. Sarah had remarried a good man who'd been kind to Michael and Jennifer. She didn't blame David anymore, she said. Time and his public redemption had softened the anger into something like understanding. They want to see you, she said finally. Both of them. Michael's getting married next month. He wanted to invite you, but didn't know how. David felt tears he didn't try to hide. I have a new family now. A wife, a young daughter. I don't know how to merge these worlds. Carefully, Sarah said. Honestly, with the understanding that love isn't finite. Your heart having new people doesn't mean there's no room for the old ones. She gave him Michael's number before leaving a bridge to a past he'd thought was permanently burned. That night, David told Rachel about the encounter. She listened without judgment, holding his hand as he struggled with the possibility of reconnecting with his children. "You should call him," she said finally. "Hope should know she has siblings. They should know they still have a father. What if they reject me? What if seeing me just reopens old wounds? Then at least you'll know. The not knowing, the wondering, that's what eats at you. I've seen it." David stared at the phone number for 3 days before finally calling. Michael's voice deeper than he remembered, but unmistakably his son's answered on the 3rd ring. "Dad." The word broke something in David, a dam he'd built to contain the grief of losing his first family. "Michael, God. Michael, I'm so sorry." "I know, Dad. I know. Can we meet?" "Just coffee, nothing big. I need to see you." They met at a small cafe in downtown Seattle. Michael was 28 now, an engineer engaged to a woman named Lisa, who knew his whole history and encouraged the reconciliation. He looked like David had at that age before everything went wrong. "You saved all those kids," Michael said after the initial awkwardness passed. "The news didn't say it was you at first, but I knew. The way you thought, the patterns you saw. I knew it was my dad. I couldn't save myself for a long time. But you did eventually. That matters. Mom told us about your new family. Are you happy?" David thought about it. "Yes. In a way I didn't think was possible anymore. But there's always been a hole where you and Jennifer should be. Jennifer's struggling with this more than me. She was younger when everything happened. She remembers more of the anger, less of the good times before. I understand. But she's willing to try. Maybe you could come to the wedding. Bring your family? Let us all try to figure out what this looks like going forward." David agreed, and a month later he stood in a church watching his son get married. Rachel beside him in a blue dress, Hope in her arms, wearing a flower girl outfit, even though she wasn't in the wedding party. Jennifer had nodded at him when he arrived, not quite ready for more, but not running away either. During the reception, Hope charmed everyone, her innocent joy, breaking down barriers that years of pain had built. She called Michael her big brother without hesitation, climbed into Jennifer's lap, despite having just met her, and somehow made the impossible situation feel possible. "She's beautiful," Jennifer said to David during a quiet moment. "Your daughter." "So are you," David replied. "You grew up amazing despite everything." "Not despite, because. I learned what I didn't want to be by watching you fall, and now I'm learning what's possible by watching you rise." It wasn't forgiveness exactly, not yet, but it was a beginning. The two families began a careful dance of integration. Sunday dinners once a month, shared holidays when possible, slow rebuilding of trust and connection. Michael came to love Hope, becoming the protective big brother she'd never had. Jennifer remained more distant, but gradually warmed, especially after she saw David at work, watched him save other families from the pain theirs had experienced. It was during this period of healing that the biggest test came. Hope was 4, now smart and curious and fearless, like both her parents. David had picked her up from preschool on a Tuesday afternoon, a normal day in their increasingly normal life. They were walking to the car, Hope chattering about finger painting, when David noticed the van. White, nondescript, but with the engine running and no driver visible. His instincts, honed by years of hunting predators, screamed danger. He picked up Hope, moving quickly toward their car, but the van doors opened first, 3 men emerged, faces covered, moving with professional precision. David recognized the formation, the intent. This wasn't random. This was targeted. "Hope, remember the game Daddy taught you," he said quietly. "Hide-and-seek emergency," she whispered back, her little body tensing. "Yes. When I say run, you run to Mrs. Chen's store and hide behind the counter. Don't come out until Mommy or I get you." "Okay, Daddy." The men were 20 feet away when David acted. He threw Hope toward the store entrance, shouting, "Run!" Then turned to face the attackers. He couldn't fight 3 trained men, but he could buy time. The first man reached him, and David went for maximum disruption rather than victory. He gouged at eyes, struck at throats, fought dirty in ways that would have appalled the detective he'd once been, but came naturally to the survivor he'd become. He heard Hope scream once, then the bell of Mrs. Chen's store door. She was safe, relatively. Now he just had to survive long enough for help to arrive. The second man had a taser. David felt the electricity course through him, dropping him to his knees. But even as he fell, he managed to activate the panic button Rachel had insisted he carry, sending their location to every cop in a 5-mile radius. The third man was raising something, a syringe probably, when the sirens started. Close multiple converging. The men looked at each other, calculated odds, and ran for the van. David tried to memorize the license plate, but his vision was blurring, the taser's effects combined with what felt like a concussion, making everything spin. Rachel arrived in 90 seconds that felt like hours. She found David on the sidewalk, blood streaming from his nose, but alive and conscious enough to point toward Mrs. Chen's store. "Hope's safe," he managed. "Chen's, hidden." Rachel ran to the store while calling for paramedics, finding Hope exactly where David had told her to hide. The 4-year-old was terrified but unharmed, clutching the emergency phone David had taught her to use. "I called 911 like Daddy showed me," she said proudly through her tears. "And I hid just like in the game." The van was found abandoned 3 miles away, wiped clean of prints, but not of DNA. The attackers were traced to a remnant of the Shadow Railroad, that David had missed a cell that had gone dark during the raids, but never been caught. They'd waited 2 years for revenge, studying David's new life, waiting for him to get comfortable to let his guard down. But David Cole didn't let his guard down anymore. Even in his normal life, he'd been prepared, had trained Hope without traumatizing her, had carried emergency beacons, had built relationships with every store owner on their usual routes. The cell was rounded up within a week, the last gasps of the Shadow Railroad finally extinguished. But the incident changed things. David realized that normal might always be relative for their family, that his past would always cast shadows on their present. "We could leave," Rachel suggested one night, as they watched Hope sleep Max, now too old to jump on the bed, but still maintaining his vigil from the floor. "Start completely fresh somewhere else." "We could," David agreed. "But that's not who we are. We don't run from shadows. We bring light to them." They stayed in Seattle, but David returned to limited field work, focusing on cases where his unique perspective was essential. He couldn't pretend to be a normal suburban dad when there were predators hunting invisible children. But he also couldn't be the man who'd lived for nothing but the job. He had to be both, had to find the balance between protector and father, between hero and human. Michael and Jennifer became part of this balance. They understood their father's work in ways Sarah never had saw it, not as abandonment, but as necessity. Michael even joined the police force, inspired by his father's second act, though he promised to learn from David's mistakes as much as his successes. Max passed peacefully on a spring morning when Hope was 5. The old dog who'd saved David from the streets, who'd protected their family through every danger, Mel didn't wake up from his afternoon nap. They buried him in the backyard under a cherry tree, the whole extended family gathering to honor a hero whose heroism had never needed a badge. "He was the best dog ever," Hope said solemnly at the makeshift funeral. "He was," David agreed, not trusting himself to say more. A month later, they visited the animal shelter. Not to replace Max, nothing could but to continue the cycle. They found another German shepherd, this one a puppy with one ear that wouldn't stand up properly and a tendency to trip over his own feet. "That one," Hope declared. "He needs us." They named him Duke after Charlie's dog and watched him grow into another guardian, another link in the chain of protection and redemption that defined their lives. David's work evolved over the years. He wrote training manuals, developed protocols, became the national expert on crimes involving homeless populations. He testified before our Congress, pushing for legislation that would protect the vulnerable. He never forgot where he'd come from, the bridge where he'd nearly ended the streets that had taught him to see differently. Rachel made detective, then lieutenant, their partnership extending beyond family into professional excellence. Hope grew up surrounded by heroes, understanding that courage wasn't the absence of fear, but action despite it, that falling wasn't failure if you got back up. When Hope was 7, she asked the question David had been dreading. "Dad, were you really homeless, like the people we help?" They were volunteering at a shelter serving Thanksgiving dinner when she asked. David looked at the men and women in line, saw himself in their faces, their stories. "Yes," he said simply. "I was lost and I lived on the streets and I thought my story was over." But it wasn't. No, it wasn't. Because someone saw me when I was invisible. Your mom saw me, Max saw me, and eventually I learned to see myself again. Is that why we help? Because someone helped you. We help because everyone deserves to be seen. Everyone deserves a second chance, or a third, or a fourth. We help because we can, because we've been given the gift of resurrection. And the only way to honor that gift is to share it. Hope nodded solemnly, then returned to ladling soup with the focus of someone who'd just understood their purpose in the world. 10 years passed like rain down a window, sometimes in torrents, sometimes in gentle drops, but always moving, always changing the landscape. Hope grew from that 7-year-old serving soup into a 17-year-old who carried her father's intensity and her mother's steadiness, who could read a crime scene like poetry and comfort a traumatized child like she'd been born to it. She'd grown up in the spaces between light and shadow, understanding that heroes weren't people in capes, but those who chose to look when everyone else looked away. It was a Thursday morning when everything David had built threatened to collapse again. He was 53 now, gray threading through his hair like silver memories lines on his face that marked each life saved and lost. He stood in his office at the Seattle PD looking at a photograph that had arrived in the morning mail. No return address, no message, just an image that made his blood freeze. The photo showed Pete Morrison's grave in Detroit, fresh flowers placed on it. But it was the item beside the flowers that stopped David's heart. His old detective badge, the one he'd thought was destroyed when he'd left Detroit in disgrace. Someone had it. Someone was sending a message. Rachel found him there an hour later, still staring at the photograph. She took one look at his face and closed the door behind her. "What is it?" He handed her the photo wordlessly. Rachel studied it, her detective's mind already working through possibilities. Someone from Detroit. Has to be. But everyone connected to that mess is either dead or in prison. "Everyone you know about," Rachel corrected. "David, this feels like someone's been waiting, watching, biding their time for 10 years. That afternoon, another package arrived. This time it was a video file on a USB drive. David and Rachel watched it together in a secure room, their hearts sinking with each frame. The video showed David during his homeless years, footage he didn't know existed. David drunk and stumbling. David in fights with other homeless individuals. David at his absolute worst, the man he'd been before redemption found him. But it was the final clip that was devastating David in what looked like a drug deal, money changing hands. Though David knew he'd never dealt drugs, not even in his darkest moments. "It's fake," Rachel said immediately. "Deep fake technology. Has to be." "Doesn't matter if it's fake if people believe it," David replied. "This could destroy everything. The programs, the trust we've built, the kids we're trying to help." The phone rang. Captain Patricia Chen, who'd taken over from Morgan 5 years ago, sounded grim. "David, we have a problem. Someone just sent a package to every major news outlet in Seattle. Videos of you from your homeless period. They're not flattering." Within hours, the story exploded. Homeless heroes' dark past revealed. Did David Cole deal drugs while on the streets? The man who saves children, saint or sinner. David watched his life's work crumble in real time. The federal task force suspended him pending investigation. 3 cities canceled his scheduled training seminars. Parents pulled their kids from the youth program he'd established. Even some of the homeless individuals he'd been helping looked at him differently and wondering if he'd been just another predator all along. Hope came home from school in tears. "Everyone's saying you're a fraud, Dad. They're saying you were never really a hero, that you fooled everyone." "What do you think?" David asked his daughter. "I think someone's scared of you. Someone who doesn't want you to keep helping people. The question is, why now? What are you close to that has them panicked?" David looked at his 17-year-old daughter with new respect. She was right. This wasn't random. The timing meant something. That night, while the media storm raged, David's phone rang with a number he didn't recognize. He almost didn't answer, but something made him pick up. "Hello, David." The voice was old, refined, familiar, in a way that took him a moment to place. "It's been a very long time." "Commissioner Blake." David's mind raced. Harrison Blake had been the Detroit police commissioner when Pete died, had been the one to suggest David leave quietly. "Former commissioner, I retired 8 years ago. I'm calling because I owe you the truth, and it seems someone else is determined to bury you with lies." "What truth?" "Pete Morrison didn't die because he found corruption. He died because he found something much worse. A program run out of Detroit using homeless individuals for intelligence operations. Not official ops, black budget off the books, completely illegal. Pete stumbled onto it, and they killed him for it." David's legs felt weak. He sat down heavily. "You knew." "I suspected. But I had no proof, and the people running it made it clear that pushing would result in more bodies. So I convinced you to leave to save your life." "Who ran it?" "That's the thing, David. I never found out. But whoever it was, they're still active, and I think you've gotten close to them again without realizing it." David thought about his recent cases, the patterns he'd been tracking. There had been something, a consistency in certain disappearances that suggested organization rather than random predation. He'd been building a case slowly, carefully. "The disappearances in the tech corridor," David said suddenly. "Young homeless individuals with technical skills vanishing without a trace. You're onto something they don't want exposed. David, these people have resources you can't imagine. They've waited 10 years for you to become important enough that destroying you would matter. You need to be very careful." "Why are you telling me this now?" Blake was quiet for a moment. "Because I'm dying. Cancer. 3 months, maybe less. I couldn't go without warning you, without trying to make right what I helped make wrong." After Blake hung up, David sat in the darkness of his home office, pieces of a decade-old puzzle finally clicking into place. Pete hadn't just found corruption, he'd found a shadow organization using society's most vulnerable as disposable assets. And now David had found them too, without even realizing it. Rachel found him there at midnight, Duke at his feet, staring at a wall covered with case files, connections drawn in red string, like a conspiracy theorist's fever dream. "You're scaring me," she said. "I should scare you. We're not fighting criminals, Rachel. We're fighting something institutional, something that's been using the homeless as resources for decades. Then we fight smart. We fight together. We don't let them isolate you." The next morning, David did something unexpected. Instead of hiding from the media storm, he called a press conference. He stood before the cameras, Rachel and Hope beside him, and told the truth. 10 years ago, I was a broken man living on the streets. I drank to forget the partner I'd failed to save. I fought to survive. I did things I'm not proud of. But I never dealt drugs, never preyed on others, never lost the core of who I was, even in my darkest moments. He held up the photo of Pete Morrison's grave. "Someone is trying to destroy me because I'm close to exposing something they've hidden for over a decade. They killed my partner in Detroit for finding it. They're trying to kill me professionally for getting close to it again. But here's what they don't understand. I've already been destroyed once. I survived it. I came back from it. And I will not stop protecting the vulnerable no matter what lies they spread." The response was mixed. Some believed him, some didn't. But Charlie, now running a network of homeless shelters across the Pacific Northwest, mobilized his people. Within days, hundreds of testimonials flooded social media from individuals David had helped, saved, protected. The homeless community, so often voiceless, found their voice in defending one of their own. Michael and Jennifer stood by their father, publicly giving interviews about redemption and second chances. Even Sarah, David's ex-wife, made a statement supporting him, saying that whatever David had been in his darkest moments, he'd become something extraordinary. But the shadow organization wasn't done. 3 nights after the press conference, Hope didn't come home from her volunteer shift at the shelter. David got the call at 7 p.m. Hope always checked in if she was running late. Always. He tried her phone straight to voicemail. Called the shelter she'd left an hour ago. Her car was found abandoned halfway home, driver's door open, engine still running. The kidnapping of a cop's child should have triggered massive response, but David found resistance at every turn. Resources were suddenly unavailable. Officers were reassigned. It was as if the system itself was working against him. "They have people everywhere," Captain Chen said, frustration evident in her voice. "I'm being blocked by my own superiors." David looked at Rachel, saw his own determination reflected in her eyes. "Then we do this ourselves." They activated networks built over years. Charlie's homeless army hit the streets. Michael used his police connections to work around official channels. Jennifer, now an investigative journalist, leveraged media contacts. Within hours, they had more intelligence than the official investigation that wasn't really happening. A homeless veteran named Tommy, the same one who'd given David information about Maria Santos years ago, saw something. Black SUV, government plates, headed toward the old Boeing facility. Driver looked military, passenger in the back was small, maybe unconscious. David didn't wait for backup that wouldn't come. He and Rachel, accompanied by Charlie and 6 of his most trusted men, went to the facility themselves. It was massive, abandoned, the perfect place to disappear someone. They found Hope in a medical wing, unconscious but alive, hooked to monitoring equipment. But she wasn't alone. 12 other young people were there, all homeless or runaways, all subjects in some kind of experiment David couldn't immediately understand. "Dad." Hope's voice was weak but clear as she regained consciousness. "I knew you'd find me. Always, baby. Always." As David held his daughter Charlie and his men documented everything, streaming it live to Jennifer's media contacts. The Shadow Organization had made a fatal mistake. They'd made it personal, and they'd underestimated the power of the networks David had built. The facility was more than just a medical testing site. It was a training ground, turning homeless youth into intelligence assets programmed and controlled through a combination of drugs and psychological manipulation. The program Pete Morrison had discovered in Detroit had metastasized, spread across the country, hidden in the margins where nobody looked. Federal agents arrived within the hour, but not to help. They came to contain, to suppress, to make it all go away. But it was too late. The live stream had gone viral. The evidence was public. The Shadow Organization's decades of exploitation were exposed. The man who appeared to take charge introduced himself as Deputy Director Harrison from Homeland Security. David recognized the type, clean-cut official, the kind of man who could order atrocities and sleep soundly. "Mr. Cole, you've stumbled into a matter of national security. I'm going to need you and your people to sign non-disclosure agreements and walk away." "No," David said simply. "I don't think you understand." "I understand perfectly. You've been using homeless kids as expendable assets for intelligence operations. You killed my partner for discovering it. You tried to destroy me for getting close again. And now, you kidnapped my daughter. There's no walking away from this." Harrison's expression didn't change. "You have no idea what you're interfering with. These operations have prevented dozens of terrorist attacks, saved thousands of lives. By destroying hundreds of others, by treating human beings as disposable resources. Sometimes sacrifices are necessary for the greater good." David thought about all the sacrifices he'd seen, all the greater goods that had been used to justify horror. The moment you decide some people are expendable, you've lost the right to decide anything. The standoff might have escalated, but Jennifer had done her job too well. News vans were arriving. Senators were calling for investigations, and the FBI's legitimate leadership was asserting control. Harrison and his Shadow Organization had operated in darkness for decades, but David had dragged them into the light, and they withered under scrutiny. The investigation that followed revealed the true scope of the program. Homeless individuals across the country had been recruited, trained, used, and discarded for 30 years. Some were turned into informants in criminal organizations. Others were used as test subjects for psychological operations. Many simply disappeared when they were no longer useful. David testified before Congress, his voice steady as he laid out the evidence. "We created a permanent underclass in this country, people we deemed invisible, worthless, expendable. And then we're surprised when predators use that invisibility for their own purposes. This program was possible because we as a society decided some people don't matter. That ends now." The legislation that followed was called Hope's Law, protecting homeless individuals from exploitation, creating oversight for any government interaction with vulnerable populations. It wasn't perfect, but it was a start. Hope recovered fully, though she carried a new wariness that broke David's heart. His little girl, who'd grown up fearless, had learned that monsters were real and sometimes wore official badges. But she also carried a new determination. "I'm going to law school," she announced at 18. "Criminal prosecution. Someone needs to hold the line when you and Mom retire." "We're not retiring anytime soon," Rachel protested. "Good. We'll need all the help we can get." The Shadow Organization was dismantled. Its leaders prosecuted, its victims compensated, though no amount of money could restore what had been taken. Harrison disappeared before trial, his body found in the Potomac a week later. Suicide, the report said, though David had his doubts. Commissioner Blake lived long enough to see justice served, dying 2 weeks after David's congressional testimony. His last words to David were, "Pete would be proud. You finished what he started." Life gradually returned to something resembling normal, though normal for the Cole family would never be what it was for others. David returned to his work with new purpose, knowing now that the threats to the vulnerable came not just from individual predators, but from systems that saw people as resources rather than humans. Rachel made captain the youngest in Seattle PD history, her leadership informed by years of seeing both the best and worst of law enforcement. She reformed the department from within, creating programs that turned cops into guardians rather than warriors. Michael rose through the ranks in Portland, carrying forward the work David had started there. Jennifer's investigative journalism exposed 3 more exploitation rings, her understanding of the invisible populations, giving her insights others missed. But it was Hope who truly carried the torch forward. She graduated law school at 24, passing the bar on her first try, and immediately went to work prosecuting crimes against the homeless. Her first case was against a tech company using homeless individuals as unregulated gig workers, paying them pennies while profiting millions from their labor. "You taught me to see the invisible, Dad," she said after winning the case. "Now I make sure justice sees them too." David stood in his office one evening 5 years after the shadow organization's fall, looking at the wall of photos. Pete Morrison, Max Charlie, who'd died peacefully 2 years ago, and dozens of others who'd been part of this journey. Rachel found him there as she always did when he needed her. "Regrets?" she asked. "No," David said. "Not regrets, just awareness of how easily it could have gone differently. If you hadn't seen me that night, if I hadn't acted, if hope hadn't been so strong. But it didn't go differently. We're here, we're together, and we're still fighting." Duke, getting old now himself, padded in and lay down at their feet. Outside, Seattle's eternal rain continued washing the streets, creating mud and mess, and the constant renewal that defined the city. David's phone rang. Another case, another disappeared child, another predator thinking the invisible were easy prey. He looked at Rachel, who was already reaching for her own phone, ready to mobilize their networks. "Once more unto the breach?" she asked with a slight smile. "Always," David replied. "That's what we do. We hold the line between the predators and the prey, between the darkness and the light." As they prepared to leave, Hope called. She was in Washington, D.C., arguing a case before the Supreme Court about homeless rights, but she always checked in. "Dad, I'm watching the news. Another missing kid." "Yeah, we're on it." "Good. Hey, Dad, I love you, both of you. Thank you for showing me that falling isn't the end of the story. It's just another chapter, sweetheart. Just another opportunity to rise." They headed out into the rain, an aging cop and a former homeless detective still fighting, still protecting, still refusing to let the vulnerable be prey. Behind them, the walls of their office held the evidence of lives, saved families, reunited predators stopped. Ahead lay more battles, more shadows to illuminate, more invisible souls to see and save. The work would never be done. There would always be those who saw the vulnerable as resources, who operated in the margins where society didn't look. But there would also always be those like David and Rachel and Hope, the ones who refused to look away, who stood between the darkness and the innocent, who believed that everyone deserved to be seen, to be saved, to be given second chances. In Portland, Michael Cole responded to a call about a disturbance at a homeless camp, remembering his father's teachings about seeing the human behind the circumstance. In D.C., Hope Cole Turner argued that homelessness was not a crime, but a societal failure that required compassion, not punishment. In newsrooms across the country, Jennifer Morrison, having taken Pete's name to honor the man whose death started this journey, exposed those who preyed on the vulnerable. And in Seattle, in a modest office in the police department, David Cole looked at the photo of Pete Morrison one more time before heading out to save another life. "We did it, partner," he whispered. "We held the line." The rain intensified as they drove toward the new case, but David didn't mind. Rain washed things clean, created new beginnings, reminded him that redemption was always possible, even for those who'd fallen the furthest. He'd been proof of that. Now he spent his life making sure others got the same chance. Duke barked from the back seat, eager despite his age, ready to help, to protect, to serve. 3 generations of German shepherds had walked this path with David, from the streets to salvation to service. The cycle continued, hope persisting even in the darkest corners, light finding its way through the smallest cracks. "You know," Rachel said as they drove, "I sometimes wonder what would have happened if you hadn't warned me that night. If you'd just stayed silent, stayed invisible." David thought about it, about the 1,000 different ways that night could have gone. Everything would be different. I'd probably be dead. You might be too. All those kids we saved, the programs we built. Hope herself, none of it would exist. One moment of choosing to act instead of looking away, and look what it became. "That's all heroism is," David said. "The decision to act when it would be easier not to. The choice to see when it would be simpler to be blind. The courage to speak when silence would be safer." They arrived at the scene, another abandoned building, another desperate search for a missing child. But they weren't alone. Officers who'd been trained in David's methods were already there. Social workers who understood the invisible populations were gathering intelligence. The homeless community, no longer afraid of police because of the bridges David had built, were offering information. The child was found within 3 hours, scared but unharmed, the kidnapper arrested without violence. It was a victory, small in the grand scheme, but everything to that child and their family. As they drove home, Rachel got a text from Hope. "Saw the news. Another save. Another light in the darkness. Proud of you both." David smiled, thinking about the journey from that bridge to this moment. He'd lost everything and found it again, different, but somehow better. He'd been invisible and learned to see. He'd been broken and discovered that the cracks were where the light got in. The rain continued, eternal and cleansing, and David Cole continued his work, a guardian in the shadows, a voice for the voiceless, proof that redemption wasn't just possible, but powerful enough to change the world, one saved life at a time.